Thank you, Mick, for your brilliant questions. Probably some of the most thoughtful questions that I've heard, not towards me, but in general. Yeah.
This is the Inner Landscape Travel Agency. Let's saunter across the psyche through creativity, self-discovery, and the sacred. If you're curious, playful, and seeking, welcome. Hi, IJ. Thank you for joining for a conversational portrait. We originally met more than 2 years ago for an interview, and our discussion went into the why of things pretty quickly. And I remember appreciating your insight and your thoughtful and intentional approach. For me, it was an enjoyable refraction of your life philosophy. And so I was unsurprised and heavily delighted when I saw you shifted from tech into art, philosophy, and podcasting. Now, you were already doing those things before. Now they're your primary focus. So I'm grateful for your inward journeying, the reflective artifacts that you bring back to us from there, whether they're written, spoken, or painted, and your dedication to self-knowledge. Welcome, IJ Makan.
Thank you, Mick, for having me. That was a very kind introduction, and I don't have much more to say. I feel like that's a pretty high standard you put up with that introduction.
In journeying through the inner landscape, going inward requires literal and figurative silence. In your life, where is that?
Silence is a major focus in my life, and it became a major focus in my life about seven years ago, when I had a tragic event. And from there, it took me a while to actually understand the value and significance of silence. So I was in the middle of grad school writing a dissertation on the problem of evil and the existence of God, and trying to deal with this from a medieval philosophy and an analytic philosophy standpoint, and trying to get those two to engage. And then when it happened to me, when the problem happened, evil took place in my life, and I was confronted with it, that's when I really had to go and dig deep into, do I actually believe in the things that I'm writing about it, and doing a whole graduate defense on. And that led me to basically and essentially dive deeper and deeper inside of myself, and realize that it is in the silence that you fully and honestly come to grips with whether you believe and embody the things that you say you embody, right? Publicly or even privately. And since then, I've initially had to force myself into moments of silence, because it was, when you're suffering, you really don't want to be in silence, right? Because the demons are haunting you at night. The demons are taunting you. They're trying to take you away from what's important in your life, and trying to show you that actually maybe this existence is not all, it's cracked up to be what it is. Maybe this is not where you should be. It was only in my ability to remain in the silence, to persist through that, and face those demons and face the darkness, that I came out of it stronger. And as a result of that, I've taken silence to be crucial and very important. So I try to implement silence, doing silent retreat personally, every year, at least once or twice a year. And it's not, I know some people do silent retreat for 10 days. None of my silent retreats are that long. It's usually either a day or 4 days. And that's when I really try to just have a book to read, a book to write in, and just myself. And those moments that I've taken have allowed me to understand myself better, understand my relationship to the world, to you, to my family, and realize that the noise around us, if you're not careful, distract you so much that you feel like you're living life, right? Because you're always inundated with noise and you think, oh yeah, this is what life is supposed to be. But then when you do a silent retreat and say you go for a walk, you turn off your phone, you have no contact, and you simply go for a walk in and of itself, which is something that me personally, I don't enjoy doing. Like, I'm not a walker. My wife is a huge walker. So like whenever she says, do you want to walk? I'll be like, I'd say, oh, how long are we planning on walking? Where are we planning on going? Right. And that was always me. But then I realized during my silent retreats that I would go on walks. And during my walks, I would have, realizations or things that I'd been thinking about that I never really put the two ideas together. There's a famous story of Kant, the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He was a huge walker, right? His town set their clock to his walking schedule because he was so prompt. It's sort of like a anecdotal that lots of philosophers, sages, mystics, monks, they do walking meditation, or they walk as part of their own spiritual internal journey. So silence is something that I deeply appreciate, and I do my best to encourage friends of mine to silent retreats. And it's terrifying, right? When somebody says, hey, you should do a silent retreat, they'll be like, well, what am I going to do by myself for 12 hours or 24 hours? I don't have my phone. There's no like notification. You don't have that designer and engineer in the background who's manufactured your notifications such that it becomes so addictive. You're like, what am I going to do without this addiction? And it is very, in the beginning, if you've never done it, it's always a huge step, right? Just the act of turning off your phone. You think, man, what if something really important happens? Like somebody texts me like, hey, you won the lottery. Hey, the feature you just shipped just completely broke, whatever it is. But more often than not, those are just your lower man trying to prevent you from entering the silence. So yeah, silence is very important. I highly recommend to my friends that they should always practice silence.
When you're in one of those silent states, whether it's at a retreat, whether it's something at home, what types of thoughts tend to muddy it up for you?
To me, the most difficult part would be if I am thinking of, say, an idea that I've been mulling on, right? Let's say I'm thinking on the relationship between the Impressionist movement. I'm just making the Impressionist movement and this philosophical idea that your mind is a tabula rasa. It's a blank slate. And so, the Impressionists are trying to portray this idea of a blank slate. So they paint the way they paint. And if I'm thinking about this, when I'm in the mornings, when I'm meditating and when I'm praying, the first thing I want to think about is the thing that I've been thinking about the previous night, or like things that I've been writing about. So it's easy for me to get distracted by my thoughts of trying to connect ideas together. And so those are, obviously for some people, they might think, oh, actually, that's maybe the whole point of meditation and your silence, that it allows you to do these things. But I think the silence that you practice in your daily life in small ways, right? Whether that's you're praying or whether you're meditating in the morning or in the evening, the silent practice itself should be an end in itself and not a means to an end. And, there are effects that occur, like we were talking about the epiphanies that you have, that those are just effects, but you're not doing the silent retreat so that you can have these epiphanies, because there are lots of times and moments when you're doing a silent retreat and nothing happens. But if you entered it thinking that something should happen, then you leave disappointed. But the whole point of the silence and implementing silence in your life is not that you're doing it for a means to an end, but you're doing it so that you can learn to be present in the moment, right? And that itself is very, very difficult. And so, like, for me, when my mind wanders, I know that when my mind is wandering in this particular moment, when I'm trying to do it, it's wandering because I'm I'm in an internal battle of trying to be present and as wholly alive in that moment as possible, trying to, feel all the stiffness of my back or the stiffness of my knees and my arms, and I want to crack my neck and I want to take a big, sigh of relief. Like, all those are distracting. I take those to be distractions when I'm actually trying to be present. And so, yeah, it's a matter of like thoughts and not being fully here when you're doing it.
When, as you just said now, the idea of feeling the stiffness of your back rather than trying to not feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Those are not words that that I've associated previously of, I want to embrace that. It's, I want to push through it or find a way around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this is for me personally. What I've found is the more I am trying to be present, right? The more my body tries to prevent me from doing it, right? The more my body goes, actually, you haven't cracked your left knuckle in a while, right? It's been like 15 minutes. And then I can feel the urge just building around my knuckle. And obviously, at times I'll just go, I'm just going to crack it. And those are when I go, I should have not done that, And not that there's a wrong way or a right way to do it. But for me, the moments in which felt like I've been most alive is when those distractions of my particular body, I can transcend it, or I can overcome those, minor pulls and tugs, even of my own mind, or like not, say, cracking my back when I'm like sitting and I stretch my back and I feel this popping sensation up and down my spine, because I know that I certainly use that as an escape to go, okay, this is getting uncomfortable, right? This total silence is getting uncomfortable. Let me just move my back, and I can hear at least some sound that's reverberating through my body.
You've alluded to this, and I'm curious to go further. What do you think about when you're not thinking about anything?
What I liked, and this was something that I learned from learning more and about the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama specifically, in when he was, obviously he abandons his kingdom, his family, to when he sees the suffering in his own kingdom, and he goes on a journey to find enlightenment. And so he practices very strict ascetic practices, right? With the sannyasis, the Hindu holy men, for a few years, where he doesn't eat. Like, he's a very strict vegetarian. He tries to eat maybe one meal a day, and he does this for a few years, and nothing happens. And then he's like, he's confused. He's like, I thought these were supposed to take me to attain nirvana. And so nothing happens. And, he remembers one day that the one moment in his life that he felt the most alive, most present, was a memory he had of his father tilling the field, and he was sitting under a tree. And it was when he was fully aware of everything that was happening around him. And so the practice that he had been doing up until this point was going inward, right? So it was like an inward journey fully, and sort of losing your connection to the sensory world. But then the moment, the memory he had, which he felt he was closest to nirvana, to enlightenment, was when his senses were fully engaged with the world around him. And he goes, oh, I guess I've been doing this wrong. So then, obviously, famously, he sits under the tree, the Bodhi tree, and he goes outward, right, with his meditation practice. And he allows all the things to, he doesn't cut any distraction from the sensory world, but he allows it all and he allows himself to feel all of it. And that's when Mara, the evil one, comes and tries to tempt him with his daughters, his children, his sons. When I first came across that, I thought, yeah, I have personally have tried to focus on the aesthetic of like cutting away the culling away all the sensory input, right? But I've found that when I have been most alive would be probably the closest word I can think of at this point, is when I haven't culled away. I've culled away the distractions like my phone and all the other things, like my random thoughts, but have allowed myself to feel and sense the grass on my bare feet as I'm meditating or as I'm praying, or allow the birds chirping outside, and for myself to fully appreciate that while I'm in this state. So yeah, so in terms of distracting thoughts, initially it would be, I would have gone, oh man, this robin is very annoying, this blue jay is very annoying, let me just turn my mind off and go so deep that I can't hear the noise anymore, versus coming out, that analogy they use of within Buddhism of the tortoise coming out of its shell, versus like the ascetic practice of going inward into its shell. The going outward I found personally to be a much more holistic approach once you've called the actual distracting things, right? The unnatural distractions.
I was thinking about the image of being so aware of your surroundings, where it's an awareness without discernment. You're not trying to enter into everything. It's just you're not reacting to it. Yeah, you are.
There's a book by Joseph Pieper called Leisure. He's talking about the importance of leisure in your life, and there's one point that he makes in there about the intellect, and the whole argument is specifically in our day and age where we are hyper productive focus and hyper output focus, you need leisure, otherwise you're going to start living meaningless lives. We know people who outwardly are very successful but inwardly feel a sense of complete despair. They might have all the normal successes that we would see as success, but internally they are in a state of existential anxiety at all times. People's point is you need leisure. And so what he says is, to actually enter states of leisure, you need silence. You need moments where you're resting, but you're not resting like you would do on a Sunday afternoon watching a football game and eating a packet of chips and watching the TV, but resting where you are allowing yourself to sit in silence and let your intellect apprehend.
If you think about the people in your life, with whom can you share silence?
My wife, certainly. I have a friend. The last time I did a silent retreat for a longer period of time was with a friend of mine, Mike, and we went up to the monastery up 3 hours from here, 4 hours from here. That was the first time that I had done a silent retreat with somebody else. The way it happened was, I had been trying to book the Abbey Saint Benoit, which is the Benedictine Abbey, for years, and it didn't happen. And I had told my friend Mike about it. I was like, yeah, I've been trying to book this monastery for years, and they're always like booked out. And then one day I called. They're like, oh yeah, we got like a few days. And I said, okay, I want to book it. And so then I told my friend Mike about it, and we did the whole thing. And what I found was, obviously I enjoy, okay, Mike's a good friend of mine, so we enjoy having conversations with each other, but it was a different time where for 2-3 days we would see each other right in the hallway, at supper, at meal times, walking up and down, reading in the library, but there was no words exchanged, just like a smile or a nod. And that was a beautiful experience for me, doing that with somebody that I knew, where it was the sense of we are close enough as friends and good enough as friends that I don't have the need to constantly be speaking at all times. But then more so in daily conversations. One thing that and I'm sure I have the tendency to do this even on podcasts, especially when I was like interviewing people, I would try to fill the silence. I found that I don't have to always fill the gaps when I'm having conversations with people. Say we're talking, you say something very insightful, and I'm just thinking about it. Previously, I probably would have said something just to fill that void where I don't want to come across as somebody who's not paying attention, right? Whereas now, I don't mind so much because the reason I'm silent if we're having a conversation and you say something is because I'm actually thinking and I'm allowing myself to process the insight or whatever it is that you say. And sometimes it's just people stop talking because they are also thinking. So on that note, there are certainly a few friends that I do this with, and in all our lives there are certain friends that are at the stage that I was years ago, and so one can't look at them and say, "Oh, I'm better than you because I can implement silence in my life." It's just we're all at different stages. Not one is not better than the other, but it is a beautiful thing to be able to be secure in yourself, in what you think, how you process ideas, that you can be in silence with another.
As you're describing the episode with your experience with your friend in the monastery, I immediately went to Esther Perel's description of how important it is to see your partner in a different context, perhaps the context in which they are most themselves outside of your relationship. And by seeing this new side of them, new to you, existing for them, you get to re-meet them outside of the daily context in which you interact, and how valuable that is also for friendships. I haven't made that connection of to be around someone and there is no shyness about being quiet with them. And it's not a reflection in either of you that the silence is perhaps a negative thing or an absence of something. In fact, it is something that you're trying to cultivate, which is deliberate. I'm curious for you. We're speaking about the idea of having thoughts fade away or be aware of them and to let them go when they do come up. What are thoughts that you enjoy thinking?
Certainly, I am very lenient towards philosophy, theology, religion as a whole. Obviously, I'm painting a very broad brush by saying religion. Anything related to that, those are things that make me excited. And the other thing would be beauty, and strongly towards how can we usher in a form of movement or a way in which you and I and other people live more meaningful lives. Is it through art? Is it through music? Is it through poetry? I mean, it's a combination of all, in my opinion. But there are certain conversations it's important to have. And I'm certainly aware that, and this is something that I have had to work on over the years, is it's much easier for me to read and to enjoy and have discussions with friends over these topics versus me actually doing the work, right? It's much easier for me to be an art critic. Let me actually, instead of only criticizing, let me participate and try to bring that change about. Those are things that I'm actively working on, where it's okay, I can't simply talk. I have to, through my action, participate in it. I enjoy these things. They at least give me a sense of grounding as to why I'm doing the things that I'm doing, or as to why I believe, as to why my actions towards certain things are this way. The silence we talked about in the beginning. I could easily practice science without having any comprehension of why I thought it was important. or without any self-reflection, but I find that the self-reflection on, okay, why have I found this helpful? Why should I do this more often? Those give me anchoring points where, as I'm, you know, learning more and growing, I could see those anchoring points and say, okay, yes, I've thought about these things and perhaps I was mistaken here, and go up and sort of like ascend upwards. So anything related to those are kind of makes me excited.
I think your answer blended this, and so I want to focus on this aspect a little bit more. What about your favorite sensory experiences?
Definitely visual, yeah, visual and like tactile are like two things that I'm most drawn towards. And visual insofar as like seeing beautiful paintings and art, but also it doesn't happen to me as often. Maybe I'm just not at the stage of enlightenment, stage of reaching this point of enlightenment. But I don't find that sunsets and sunrises and climbing up the highest mountain and kind of looking out, that sense of awe that certain people experience, it's not as strong in to me versus like if I go into the National Art Gallery and then I see, paintings by like Titian or Botticelli. I'm like, wow, this is there's a I'm like drawn into the artwork. That's partially because I do painting myself, and so I have that inclination. And as you already know from what I just said earlier about my years of apprehension towards walking has a strong role into why I don't have that pleasure in nature, even though I like nature. So yeah, when I say tactile, I mean specifically when I'm training jiu-jitsu and wrestling. Like I've found that those are pleasurable, and so it's pleasurable in that I find tremendous satisfaction in doing these things. Because it's one of those activities where I can implement in a very raw manner the notion of being present. Because as you very well know, if you're not fully present in your practice, whether you're wrestling or doing jiu-jitsu or any sort of other mixed martial art, any sort of like sparring martial arts, the moment you lose focus and you're not present, bang, you're getting choked out, your arms getting broken, your legs getting broken, you're getting knocked out. So you have to be fully present. And so I find that the practice of jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, complements my other practice of like meditative practices, and they go hand in hand. I tend to recommend to my friends who are either doing only martial arts or either only doing meditative practice, say, hey, you have to just do both, or at least try both, and you'll find that they complement each other very, very well. Understandably, this is why historically the martial arts practice in the East have always incorporated some form of spirituality, esoteric practices in, because I assume they came across, they're like, yeah, this actually makes sense.
I'm thinking about the idea of being in a museum with you, and also in a natural landscape, and how we would react differently to that, or what areas we would want to emphasize to each other. And more broadly, this is a question we're going to come back to from multiple angles, I'm sure, throughout the discussion. I'm fascinated with the idea of sharing a space with someone and looking at the same thing, experiencing the same thing, or rather, looking at the same thing but experiencing it completely differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll never know quite what it's like to be you. And I want to get close to that. I want to understand how, through your unique set of life experiences and knowledge and skills, the unique aperture you've cultivated through circumstance and deliberate choice, what you see today that few others can. Where do you see more depth, nuance, and intricacy in a given setting?
I'm not sure if I can confidently ever say that I know more or have more depth, because obviously I'm not too sure about that. There are things that I'm certainly much more drawn towards naturally. Naturally is, again, probably not the right word here. Subjectively, I'm much more inclined towards certain things and certain combination of things: philosophy and art and theology and religion, and obviously you and I were both in tech. Anything related to that, and business. Like when you put a bunch of these things together, you're like, okay, there aren't too many people who are interested. There are lots of people interested in philosophy and theology. Then you add, say, tech, then you're like, okay, that goes significantly less. Then you add art, then it goes significantly less. And then you add like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and martial art, then it goes significantly less. And, the pie kind of gets smaller and smaller. I think sort of like the combination of those, at least I've found that watching trends play out, say, within the world of tech and business, like some things that friends have had discussion on for years on, say, we'd always talked about AI, but this is like before ChatGPT, right? This is like back in 2016. We'd always, like in philosophy of mind, you talk about, could we actually have this sort of like AGI, and what would that look like? Would that be consciousness? And up until 2020, that conversation was like wholly restricted. Not restricted, but the only people interested in it were like these obscure philosophers talking about it, and saying, well, I think John Searle's argument of the Chinese room is probably says that you can't have consciousness. It would just be a machine putting out input, doesn't know what it's actually saying. And then you have, the whole OpenAI stuff. And now it's like everybody's talking about it, but everybody is talking about it in a very technocratic manner. Like, okay, this is going to save humanity. It's a salvation that we've been waiting for. And you have the accelerationist movement sort of like pushing this. And then you have like some philosopher like, well, it's not really consciousness. And there's a whole barrage of arguments for it. But being able to see these things and having sort of dialogued previously, it makes it a bit easier to navigate the world, at least for me, and I'm sure for lots of other people. Also, it gives you a different perspective when you have experience in tech and philosophy. You can see things that the philosophers, oftentimes sitting in their high tower, don't actually see. They're not actually engaging with the work itself. Whereas in tech, oftentimes you don't really have time, or you don't actually make time for that rest to really actually reflect and like grapple with the philosophical implications of things. And every now and then I've seen leaders talk about this. I think Mark Andreessen, for example, wrote about how AI is going to save us and all this stuff. But the difference is Mark is a VC, right? He has the time to reflect, whereas the guy working on the product itself, doesn't really have time. The privilege of having had studied some of these things previously allows me a small insight into something that seems to be very impactful and will be very impactful. But again, it's not like I know technically too much about the field. It's like philosophically, yes, but technically and philosophically are not necessarily the same thing.
You mentioned being in this, if you drawing the Venn diagram of yourself, of being interested in topic X, Y, Z, and A, B, and C, and how the union at the center of all of those is gets increasingly smaller. I know that you've also grown up in the middle of many cultures. Can you talk about how you've embraced continuity with your culture and how you found it stifling?
That is a excellent question. I was thinking about this recently. I grew up in India, in a Christian family, but I grew up amongst Hindus, Muslims, and Zoroastrians, and very small amounts of Buddhists. There aren't as many Buddhists in India as, say, there are in Nepal or in Burma. On top of that, I grew up in a British boarding school in India. So you have this influence of the Brits in the way you speak, in the way you talk, the way you think about things. So something that's common amongst people like myself is there's a term, it's called the third culture kid, where they grew up in an arena within a culture that their parents are not familiar with. Even when they interact with their parents, they're not just bringing in one culture with them. That's like a whole barrage of culture, and they're trying to engage with their parents who usually would have had experience with only one culture or maybe two at most, right? And so one of the difficulties, at least that I have growing up dealt with, is how do I relate to my own culture? Because within my own culture, my own, say, my very specific tribe, the Naga Tangkhul tribe, I'm not necessarily accepted in it because my language, the way I speak is not perfect, right? I make all these like silly mistakes in my pronunciation, and I'll use a word that you say generally don't use in this particular context, but I'll use that. So I'm not really accepted in that context. But the place that I feel most accepted growing up was amongst cultural melting pot, where I feel like, okay, you and I are all experiencing this weirdness, right? At home, you're not really considered one, but here, because we're all considered unequally yoked, we feel yoked, right? We feel like we're in this together. And so one of the continuities to your question is, when you're younger, you sort of deal with it by not thinking about it, because you maybe don't have the mental capacity or the framework or the knowledge to sort of decipher and work through these things. And so as I've gotten older, one of the ways that I've allowed myself and worked through it is, one, understanding the culture. Again, this may be my own particular bias, but from a more academic or scholastic perspective of like reading books by scholars about my, say, particular tribe, and sort of trying to see it objectively, and also reading and speaking to my own parents more in depth about, okay, we do these things. Why do we do these? Like, there's this practice. Like, why do we do this practice? Why have we thrown this out? And allowing me to shape my own perspective on these things have given me a sense of, okay, I am connected to this tribe that my parents are a part of, that my grandfather, my ancestors going back, hundreds and hundreds of years, and I'm actually not this weird, what would you call it, like a weird, a bastard child has no way of going back to it. And so those things have allowed me, and I've had to think much more about it when we had our daughter, because obviously my daughter's mixed ethnicity, right? So she's like half Naga, which is what I am, and then my wife is like a mixed bag of French and Prussians and then like Dutch. So my daughter is like a total, like my daughter and all my other kids would be like a mix of these things. And so trying to teach them that they are basically the embodiment of what I lived, right? I lived in it, but I, like, physically I wasn't a mixed race, mixed ethnic, mixed cultural kid myself, like physically blood and bones. Whereas my daughter is the physical embodiment of what I went through. And so like trying to instill in her the knowledge of my own tribe that I'm also learning, so that when she is growing up, she can be grounded and have some sort of firm perspective, versus like being cast and saying, oh, actually you're not, you're not white because you're mixed, or you're not Tangkhul because you're mixed. And then, but she has the ability to be like, okay, yeah, I'm actually very secure in who I am. So that would be how I'm sort of working through it. I'm still obviously working through that.
Can you say more about your exploration of growing up as part of the Naga tribe?
So there's, in India, specifically, you have people who look typically Indians, right? You could see, you're like, oh yeah, this person looks Indian, whether they're Pakistani or Bengali. People say, oh, this person looks Indian. But then there are people like me, and there's a large group of people like me who don't really fit into the category of what an Indian, quote unquote, should look like. And obviously there's some political there's continuing political internal struggles that's going on, but not talking about those, and the the sense of like identity crisis would probably be a better word. Crisis. I mean, crisis is a very strong word to use here. So I don't know what internal, identity struggle I think would be better. It was like born and bred in me being what I am and other tribes being what they are when you go into the mainland of India, right? Because they think you're Chinese, they think you're Nepali, they think you're Thai or Vietnamese or whatnot. But when you're like, no, you and me are the same, I'm an Indian, you're an Indian. They're like, no, you can't be an Indian. And so you have this struggle. And so when I was much younger, I would be like, if you don't think I'm Indian, I don't want to be Indian. I don't want to be associated with you if you're treating me in a very poor and what nowadays you'd call in a very racist manner. Then I don't want to be participating in this group that you call Indian, that you say that you are, that I'm not, right? That I don't want to be part of that. That is certainly something that other people feel the same way about. But as I've gone older and as I'm, learning to integrate all these what seem to be disparate factions within myself, it's become very important for me to accept that I am Indian in the way that I'm sort of like in the way that anybody else is Indian in India, right? In the beginning was a struggle, and that it's weird to say, but in the beginning it was a struggle because you have faced so much like negative, slurs and so on and so forth, that you're like, why would I want to be part of your group? When you don't accept me to begin with, like, why would I be like, why would I want to be actively accepting it and embracing it? But I realized that I have to accept it to move on. And so that was like one of the biggest things for me. It's like, okay, accepting this part of me, this identity of mine that I had initially rejected. There's a funny story I'll tell you. When I was in boarding school, you could pick languages to study. So you could pick Hindi, French, or German. And I had picked French. And I was struggling between German and Hindi. And I thought, well, maybe I should learn Hindi more, because I'm Indian. But my Hindi was very bad. Yeah, I'm in grade 7. So my first Hindi class, the Hindi teacher, she writes this sentence in Hindi on the whiteboard, and she says, "IJ, read this to me." And I'm struggling to read this. I'm struggling to read this. He's like, "You can't read this?" I was like, "Sorry, ma'am, I actually can't read this." And she's like, "You are this in front of all the class, okay?" She goes, "You are a disgrace to Indians." And I was like, "Wow, those are very strong words," And everybody was laughing. I was laughing because I was like, she knows that I I'm in this class because I'm trying to learn, but her calling me out like that was one of those things. I was like, yeah, there's sort of expectation that as a kid, you're like, okay, oh, you should look like this, you should act like this, you should speak Hindi very well, or what, so on and so forth. And that now that I'm like, yeah, well, my Hindi is absolutely terrible. I probably don't remember much at all, if any, mind you. But have to accept that first allowed me to go, okay, I can now accept these other things about my tribe, which I'd accepted, but it was like, it's definitely one of those struggles and the things that you like read about, and you're like, I don't know if I necessarily want to be associated with this, but it would be rejecting part of myself completely. And so I all that to say, the objective lens makes it much easier, and understanding that just because you accept a part of you doesn't mean that you have to act the way the worst actors in that group act, right?
In what language? I'm trying to visualize the story. In what language was the teacher speaking?
She was English, because so this is a British boarding school, and so that it's
in India.
In India, yeah. So you can only speak English here unless you're in that very specific context of the classes, and you have to speak French or you have to speak German.
How have the languages that you think and dream in shifted depending on your age and where you live?
Mick, has anybody told you how insightful your questions are to the person being asked? It's funny you say that because I had a friend over, a very good friend of mine over, and we talk, very similar things that you and I talk about, and philosophy and all. And one of the discussions we were having and we've been having is something that we previously had spoken about the ineffability of language. I was saying, look, when you read the works of mystics within, say, the Christian tradition, and then you read the works of it within the Sufi, the Islamic tradition, and then you read the mystics' works within the Hindu tradition, and so on and so forth. They're all using different languages, but when you're reading them and you understand, you can apprehend what they're saying. They're not, in my estimation, they're not speaking about different objects. They're speaking about the same thing, but in a different context, a different time, and different culture, right? And they're trying to describe and whatever their object of love is in their particular language. And my friend, he somewhat disagrees with me on this topic, and and I was saying to him, a good example for me and why I say this is because I speak 3 different languages, and I can say the same thing. I can say the grass is green in 3 different ways, and everyone who speaks those 3 different languages will understand that I'm saying the same thing. But if you only speak one language, and I say the grass is green in Tangkhul or in Manipuri, but you only speak English, you'll be like, this guy's talking gibberish. And you'd say, no, you have to study the language. You have to study this. And then when you go and study this language, you can sometimes lose the actual focal point of what this, for example, these mystics were talking about, right? And it's like they're talking about the transcendental, the ineffable, the infinity that they're experiencing. But then you can get caught up in the syntax, right? The structuring of the language. You're like, no, it's actually supposed to be this grammatically. You're supposed to use this in this particular way. But to bring it back to your question is like, I've been very appreciative that I grew up speaking 3 different languages, and that doesn't make me special. I feel like the majority of people outside of North America speak more than one language, because it's allowed me to be more sympathetic, one, to those who are sort of an outsider trying to learn a new language, but also in my own philosophical study, when I'm reading and I'm trying to comprehend what this person's saying, and then I say like I read Meister Eckhart, who's a very well-known Christian mystic. So I'm reading Meister Eckhart, then I go read, the Bhagavad Gita, and Krishna is sort of revealing himself to Arjuna, and I'm like, wait a second, this, to me, as I'm reading this, like, this seems very similar to what Meister is saying, but Meister is obviously not speaking in Sanskrit, right? And so in my own life, the way that I, obviously I'm not a Jungian whatsoever, so I'll just say that right before I say what I'm about to say. In sort of the dreams that I have, and I have some very vivid dreams. There are moments in my dreams that I've had where it's like I awake from the dream, and I go, that's very strange, and I try to explain it to myself, and I'm in my mind, I'm mainly thinking in English, but I'm trying to also sometimes think in the 2 other languages, trying to like, okay, am I sort of understanding my dream correctly of what's happened? So yeah, I guess it's been like a helpful tool for me in navigating some of the more complex. Maybe it's not complex for other people, but it is complex for me in like finding a sort of perennial truth that I think is evident across time, culture, and location.
I have so many more questions about that. I want to take a quick aside. Can you share about your emphatic declaration that you're not a Jungian?
The reason I say I'm not a Jungian is mainly because I don't feel that I am adequate enough to speak well on it. And like, if you ask me, I could probably say things that sound accurate, but I'm not. I don't have the conviction to say this is 100% accurate. Like, for example, there's a philosopher, Bernard Kastrup. I don't know if he's a Jungian. I would probably assume he's a Jungian because he has a book
Strong
on.
Jungian.
Yeah, he has a whole book. And so, like, I've listened to his podcast, I've read some of his work, and I think the only way I would say I'm a Jungian is if I'm at that level. It's like, okay, I kind of understand what he's saying. Like, I understand what he's saying, but I can't
Yeah.
say that I'm a Jungian. But I do like, from all the things that I've read so far, it's like, part of me wants to say I am a Jungian, but I don't.
Gotcha. The way I interpreted your phrasing was that you find his beliefs or his work to be perhaps antithetical, not that you the idea of claiming an Ian to something means a certain degree of proficiency.
That could be that's probably my own ignorance, though. Like, other people be like, oh yeah, you could totally be a Jungian IJ. I'm like, yeah.
According to Jung, there shouldn't be an idea of Jungian.
Right.
I read a biography of his by Lawrence van der Post, the South African explorer. And
what's the biography called? It's called Dreams, Myths, and because I'm going through it. I'm going through one right now.
Memories, Dreams, and Reflections is the one that he sort of wrote. Turns out there's a lot of controversy about
That one.
the English translation and some of the liberties taken and some of the things that were filtered from there.
Oh, because that's the one I'm reading.
So Lawrence van der Post was the South African explorer, and he spent a lot of time with the Kalahari.
Yes.
And one of the big aspects of Jung was his exploration of what he referred to as the 2 million year old man. This unconscious, or these portions that are consistent within us in this timeless way, that are expressed still in our lives, but perhaps we don't have the metaphors or the symbols to process them. And so it was riveting to see a description of Jung by somebody who was so attuned to his own nature, his own more wild nature, and is exceptional in his grasp of crafting with words.
I'm gonna have to read this book.
I asked ChatGPT for recommendations on different biographies of Jung and the different angles that they take, and this is the one that stood out the most. I didn't realize he was already on my list of people to read because of his work with the Kalahari.
I'm sure the author, you said he was in the Kalahari Desert. The desert's a wild place to be in. Right? Desert's a wild that you hear voices that aren't there. You see things that aren't there, or maybe they're there. You just within your modern context, you don't see them in the cities, but in the desert, in the wild, I'm sure he would have had crazy, vivid dreams where Jung's work would have been helpful for him to go, okay, why am I seeing this woman appear to me at night? I'm obviously making, because I haven't read this book, but I'm just saying, like, some woman could appear to him, like, you have to cut off your head. Like, what?
What you're touching on is so important. Do we have the right explanations? I love jazz, and in part I appreciate it because it feels like it is an absolute emergence of the urban landscape. If it weren't for that landscape, in the context in which it could have been developed, it wouldn't have surfaced, for instance, in the desert. It is not continuous with the desert. It's continuous with the city. And if there is, I like how you phrased, in the desert, you may have relied on more of Jungian thought, or Jung's thought, not Jungian thought, because you needed an interpretation or a connection to something that's of that landscape and perhaps of the timelessness of a desert, as opposed to the inescapable ephemerality of a city. And so I've wondered, the idea of turning to the wisdom of someone, you need to turn to the wisdom of those who are connected to the landscape that they're in, so it's of their time or of the timelessness, you also need someone who can speak to the contemporary in that effective way. The thing that I'm after is finding the timeless in the contemporary. That and the pursuit of the timeless in general, like no matter what we live in, what are the things? I think this touches on your curiosity about the perennial. No matter what time we live in, we're going to see these themes repeated, these questions, these motifs come up, and they're going to be expressed in contemporary symbols. And sometimes the symbols that we have are no longer accessible to us or no longer relevant. Like I am very turned off a lot of Hebrew prayer because it
Mm.
uses words like King of Kings. And I think I can't relate to a king. I don't want to submit. I don't want to bow. Like these are not uh, experiences, or these are not translations, I should say, that I can relate to. And I was curious earlier about with what you were studying, the mystics. Do you read them only in English? Like Meister Eckhart, modern English, and Bhagavad Gita in modern English. And I know you explore different translations. I'm curious also on about that.
I mean, before I answer your question, the point you made about the timelessness. I think that's sometimes the unrelatability of certain like symbols. But I think that is very prevalent in our time where I'm using Europe here as a broad example here. But Europe has some of the most beautiful cities in the world, some of the most beautiful architecture, some of the most beautiful art. But Europe itself, like the Europeans, if anybody's European here, obviously you can be the exception to this rule. But it seems like in Europe there's the sort of the symbolism that was embedded within that culture is sort of it's lost, right? And only somebody who understands that culture, who sort of studied it, can come and appreciate it. Now, an example is a friend of mine. He's Ukrainian. His family moved here during the war, and he grew up here like 20 plus years. And for the first time, he traveled back to Europe on a Euro trip, but not in that that old Euro trip movie style, but in an actual European trip of like of seeing the city. And he was there for a month, Mick, and what he found when he came back and we had, we caught up, and he said to me, IJ, it was the first time in my life, because he doesn't remember Ukraine, right? He's only kind of grown up here. He's like, for the first time in my life, I saw beauty everywhere I went. Everywhere I went, like the buildings were beautiful. The streets were beautiful. The attitude was beautiful. Like, obviously he gave the exception of like, yeah, certain parts of Paris when he went, he's like, yeah, those were probably except, but like other places, everything about it was beautiful. And I woke up in a way that I've never woken up. Where I woke up completely enthralled to go and just go for a walk. Now, there's part of that honeymoon phase of like being in a new city. What I get from him is, for him growing up here in North America and seeing, these steel towers rising for 50, 60 floors, and these cookie cutter houses in suburbia, and your streets are all like a microchip inside of a microchip, it's all straight edges. And then going to Switzerland and kind of walking around the small villages and seeing the amount of serenity that these people had, this is according to him, was something that he had never experienced. And as a result of this, he ended up moving like out west, like out towards Vancouver for good, because Vancouver, is a very beautiful place. And so he ended up moving mainly because of his lack of a sense of beauty in the city that he was experiencing in. And for him, it was like learning. So the symbolism was there, but it was lost. I'm not saying it was lost to all the Europeans, but it was lost, and it was somebody totally new to come in and go, oh my goodness, why did my parents immigrate to Europe? Like, why did they have to immigrate to North America? I liked what you said about that. We've lost that symbolism. But your question was about the English
books.
translations.
Yeah,
that's right. Even though I speak and can read for the most part 3 different languages, I don't like languages at all to begin with, because at least I've found, and maybe this is like just within academic circles, people are very pretentious when it comes to languages, right? So like good examples in my experience has been like with Latin, with Greek, and with Hebrew. It would be people who say who can read, and I studied Koine Greek, the biblical Greek, in undergrad. People who are much more proficient can read scripture in Koine Greek in the original. And let's say you're like debating over something that Jesus said, right? The one who is more proficient will like swing their big Koine Greek mind around. Oh, you're wrong, because in this context it means one thing, blah blah blah. Or like in Hebrew, like a good example is like when you read the Old Testament in the original, people who are very much like well versed in it, will use that as a way to discredit an interpretation which might not even be wrong to begin with. And so when it comes to same thing with Latin, right? There are lots of people who say you got to read the great classics in Latin, otherwise you're not even reading the same thing. And you find this for a very different reason, obviously within the Quran, and for the Muslim, the Quran in its realist revealed form is in the Arabic. So anything other than the Arabic translation is not the real Quran. Where I've read quite a few different translations of the Quran, and when I talk to some friends who are Muslim around this stuff, it's like, well, what more would I get if I learned Arabic and I read the Quran, but then my translation turns out to be the same as X's translation, right? And I comprehended X's before reading the Quran, and the same is the case with like the other works that are not in English. My long way to answer your question is I do tend to only read the English translation, and I try to find different, and this is not always successful, but I do try to find different translations of the same work, because I find that obviously the translator is heavily biased by their own upbringing, by their own use of language, but the ideas that are important tend to stay in that original. So like within Hinduism, I think a great idea that has kept its Sanskrit form are like a few, like bhakti, like devotion, yoga, jnana, which is like knowledge, and then more important, it's like the Atman and the Brahman. Like these are ideas that you can explore. Like I'll say, okay, the Advaita Vedantists, they'll say the Atman is the Brahman, and then I explain to you what the Atman and what the Brahman is in English, and Mick gets it, everybody else gets it, but then somebody comes and says, hey, you have to read it in Sanskrit to understand it. But and my point, it's always been, it's like, well, what, I'm not saying that you wouldn't understand more, but if you have apprehended the idea behind it, is it necessary always to go and try to read it in the original language, other than one of two things: your own pride, like, oh, I read this in the Sanskrit, or I read this in Latin, I read Virgil, right? It is certainly different when you read something in the original, in the way that the author had written it, right? You feel like you're connected. Not always the case, but other people feel, yeah, I feel like I'm connected to the author. But to me, when you grow up speaking more than one language, you very early on realize that if the other person knows what I'm saying, understand all the languages that I speak, I cannot speak something behind their back if they're there without them understanding it. And the only way I could is that person doesn't understand the language. But if somebody else in the room says, actually, IJ was saying this about Mick, but they're using a common language that you shared to begin with, then no matter how esoteric that thing I was saying in, say, Manipuri, but you speak English and the person translates my Manipuri sentence into English, then you would get, and let's say you get mad at me. Somebody might say, oh, Mick didn't understand what IJ said in the Manipuri, so he's not justified in getting mad because you don't understand the essence of it, Mick. And to me, it's like, well, I don't think that's true.
One of the things I thought a lot about, and I think this is what you touched on with what you referred to as the ineffability of language. I like to think of it as words are asymptotic. The thing that I'm trying to convey with one word, you may interpret it somewhat similarly. They won't fully converge, but also the thing I'm really trying to relay or convey is nonverbal. But I'm using a verbal way to use it. I'm using the tool that is not to relay the idea of a concept. I'm implanting some of that essence for you, but I never actually convey with complete fidelity. And I think that's for the profane that works. The daily interactions, maybe you need some clarity of what exactly do you mean in this way. Some of the oddities of the English language certainly make that clear of the way that some words can be used in many different ways depending on the context that might be lost in someone who is relatively new to the language. That might be more important for anything that's sacred. And because I think in that instance, the idea of a word alluding to something is most important. We're trying to relay a specific concept. I've been trying to grasp, and I think this is going to be a perpetual exploration, whether certain languages, if we think of them as that which emanates from a culture in the land, in the time, and the context in which it was existent, and certainly the language itself evolved, so in the time as well there. These are the concepts that they were able to identify, the symbols and the allusions to something that's ineffable. Some cultures, some languages may have more granularity or more intricacy in their ability to reference something or to point you in your contemplation towards that ineffability. All of these are at this the image I have is of these very, very fine edges, and every language that aspires is just maybe getting a hair a little bit closer to it, but depending on how you navigate, you might get a little bit more. So are some languages, which is inextricable from culture and time, and so it's language hyphen culture hyphen context, are some of those more conducive to knowing the ineffable or to contemplating the ineffable than others? And where I struggle with this is also, I can read Rumi's poetry in English. I can read Hermann Hesse's translation, granted very different time periods. The beauty is palpable even when translated. So there's something that's not lost there. And I wonder just how much more beautiful it is within the native tongue. But certainly the translators themselves, granted they've imbued some of themselves into their work, the essence is there and it is profoundly resonant. So I'm torn. The translation does work, and yet is there something in the language that can be translated? In part because I also know that some languages do have limitations that others don't. I think of a story I regularly think about is there was this linguist hyphen missionary who is now only a linguist because he's lost his faith because of his missionary work, named Daniel Everett, who went to the Amazon and met the Pitahan tribe. And his recollection of this story is they were so happy, they were so content with their life and their world that it undermined his faith in Christianity and he lost it. No, it gets more complex in that they asked him about, do you believe something that doesn't exist, or do you believe something that you can't see? They would ask him very seemingly simple questions that forced him to realize he wasn't as pious as he may have been, and he left the faith. Part of his job was to translate, as missionaries do, to the native tongue.
I would love to send me if his writing or his
Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes is the book.
Okay. So that's fascinating you say that. Let me get back to that after. The point you make about the sort of nuances that seem to be more present in certain languages. Like English is you and I are freely speaking English, but anybody who's a newcomer into English, you say you pronounce one word differently if it's in a different context, right? And there are all these rules that you and I never think about. And we sort of freely speak and we break them all the time. But somebody who's new and it's oh my goodness, this is so complicated. And it also makes me more in awe of like children learning languages. Like nobody's telling them, okay, this is the right grammatical rule you're making. You gotta say it this way, but they pick it up and they pick up as many languages as they're exposed to. But yeah, there's certainly more nuances in certain languages. I think that's very true, right? For example, some of the greatest works in the West is in Latin. And all the classicists will say you have to learn Latin to really appreciate all these classic works. To me, right, it seems to be more people who are more academic, more intellectual, who obsessed with linguistic analysis and obsessed with like the importance of speaking this language and reading it the way this is read. Whereas for the experiencer, whereas for the mystics, whereas for the ones who aren't reading to acquire information, and are rather reading it to experience the truth behind the words of those things. Right? That's when there's a Rumi poem. He says something along the lines of, "He is not found in the words; he's found in the meaning." Right? And he's talking about obviously God here, and then he goes on to talk about. And there's also the very famous Sufi saying of, "A mystic who has not annihilated himself is like a bird without wings." And I find that lots of intellectuals are more like that. They're birds without wings, and they get caught up on the intricacies of flight. It's like they're like, make this is the way you should fly. You have to flap your wings 3 times to take off, or you have to take a 5-foot dive before you can get that lift. And the experience of flying, Mick, is incredible. When the wind is flying under your wings, it lifts your feathers and you can feel all the different feather fluttering in the wind and against your face is beautiful. And then when a bird with wings who's flown comes and says, "Oh, yeah, that's pretty true, but you could just fly. It feels great." And it's like, no, you don't understand. And so to me, it's like that because, again, I'll just to stick on the point about Latin. I have friends who are Catholic, very, very traditional Catholic, and they go to the Latin Mass, and they'll say things like, "IJ, the Mass is best experienced in Latin. That is the Church's language." And I always say to them, and part of it is just a bit cheeky on my end, but it's like, well, you very well know that Jesus, or your main guy, the Lord and Savior, didn't speak Latin. He spoke Aramaic. So why isn't the Church's language in Aramaic? If Latin is truly the language of the Church, is truly the one where it has all the intricacy, you would think that Jesus, the man, would have had to speak Latin to be able to expound the profound teachings that he had. But obviously he didn't. He spoke his mother tongue. I'm using this as a particular example just to illustrate the point that if Jesus, who is one of the greatest humans, one of the wisest men, can convey his message without this supposed language, which is the best language, then perhaps we are a bit too caught up in the linguistic analysis and are missing the point. Go back to Rumi's point about, he's found not in the words, but in the meaning. Right? It is the finger that's pointing to the moon, and the guy going, "Oh, actually, the moon is the finger." And yeah, that certainly that's what it is. And it's like, no, the language. Forget my hand waving. Just look at the moon. This is an illusion. Look at the moon. That's how I personally feel in terms of language. Because there are, even within my own language, there's a tremendous amount of nuance in just the word washing, right? Like the way the words used for washing your face is different than washing your feet and washing your hands. But in English, I say, "Hey, Mick, wash your face." You know exactly what I'm talking. "Hey, Mick, wash your hands." It's the same word to describe, but in Tangkhul, it's like different words are used to describe different things that seem so like trivial. And I think other people I think there's a language up in the north with one of the natives. They have different types of words for snow. At least I read about that. They have like slush, different word for slush, black ice, and whatever it is. And it's not like we don't have it in English, but they have like a very specific word targeted for it. And so there certainly seems to be more nuance involved when it's called for that particular time and age. And so, yes, the original language certainly could help expound the idea is better for somebody who doesn't understand, but for somebody who's flown and who has wings, the language is simply a ladder that you can climb, and you can climb a a more rickety language. You can climb a steel ladder. It doesn't matter so long as you climb and you fly. Then that's what it matters. That's how I understand language.
One of the struggles I've had with language is also, in seeking wisdom from books, I'm reading to get also to the asymptote that I know that I can only cross by not reading. I'm trying to get as close as I can to the wisdom through books, knowing that the only way to actually get to the wisdom is at one point to turn away from them. And I'm curious how you experience that, given the nature of a lot of your public facing work is the exploration of books of wisdom,
Right.
Exploring them. At some point, you know that there's a threshold that you'll have to cross. Knowledge, you can only know what's beyond it.
Yeah. Every week I'm reading a book and studying the book and making these. I try to make it the podcast under an hour. It takes a tremendous amount of energy and preparation. And just to back up, but part of the reason why I started doing it was precisely because I found that it's very easy for people who love to read, like yourself and myself, to just read. You're like, you know what? I'm just going to read this, and you read and read and read, and nothing ever ends up happening. And one of the main philosophies driving the way that I live my life is that conviction. I must embody my beliefs, right? And I have to be, to use Marcus Aurelius' analogy, I have to be the boxer whose weapon is his fist, and who doesn't have to put it down and pick it back up like the fencer who has to place his sword down to pick it back up. You have to be the boxer, and you have to embody that belief. And because that was the goal, I was like, when I'm reading, I'm doing it so that other people who are listening to it, and I and it's also a reminder for myself to say, okay, I read this book. There are these lessons in these books, in this book, I should say, that this is how I can apply it to my life. And so it's certainly true that to speak about the Sufis is sort of fresh in my mind because I just did the episode on the Sufis. But, one of their main points is, hey, you're not going to find this thing that we're describing in your books, right? That's like one of the points they make. You're not going to find it. You're going to find it in the practice of zikr, in the practice of breathing exercise, in the practice of fasting, in the practice of mental suffering. And I couldn't agree more with them. But the sort of dichotomy is that they have to say those things out, right? And it has to be written for somebody to read it and to digest it. And I think the continual struggle that you and I share is, after a while, it's not like the books become less meaningful, but I think it's more so that part of wisdom is removing and knowing what things to remove in your life versus like adding more books to your life, right? And I'm sure you do this. You sort of read certain books over and over again, and each time you read, you're like, oh my goodness, how did I miss this the first time? How did I miss this the second time? Right? And so for me, it's one of those things like the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, tremendously tiny book compared to all the other books I read. Right? It's like if you had to put it together, like to save space, it'd probably come out to like 20 pages at most, I would say. But every sort of stanza or chapter in the Tao Te Ching, you could read that over and over for like 5 hours, and you'd still be like, okay, I feel like I just understood like the first part of it. What I find, all this to say, what I found very helpful for me is having continually attempt to implement these ideas that I read in the books. I found it much easier to create the podcast and read more books, I should say, specifically, because my goal is not, at least I try to make sure that my goal is not the acquisition of knowledge and the acquisition of information, because that's, obviously, as I like to do that. But with that different perspective, it's allowed me to go, okay, I'm reading it. Like I'll start a book, like Steve Jobs' book, right? That big book by Walter Isaacson. Like I've started that book, Mick, so many times, and I just cannot finish that book. This is like a sort of heresy to say within the world of tech. It's like, you know, Steve Jobs is a god here for lots of people. But I find that when I'm reading about his life and I compare it, and the funny thing is, Steve is, I think he considered himself a Hindu, or at least a Vedantist of some form. His life is at odds with the way he treated people, with how a lot, if not the majority, of the greatest human minds have said what the meaning, how to live well in this life, the way you're supposed to treat people, the way you're supposed to embody your thought, the way that you're supposed to act. I find that it's at odds with, and I'm not saying this as, you know, this is the case with like all of us when we're growing up and when we're young, we do stupid things all the time. But I'm talking about like as a mature man, the way that he's treating people is like, I would have thought, as somebody who traveled to India, who went to Varanasi, studied with some of the sannyasis, that he would have treated people the way his sannyasis or his teachers would have taught him to. And I'm like, and this is my third time trying to read this book again. Okay, so I'm like trying to go through it again. Part of it is if I'm reading something, if I'm learning about somebody's life, there is an internal struggle in me as I'm reading it because I know his spiritual awakening that he has, right? Or I maybe I'm being too generous by saying spiritual awakening, but I wouldn't doubt that he did have it at Varanasi when he went. So yeah, it's sort of the embodiment, going back to Marcus, it's the embodiment of your philosophy that I think is most important. And tons of people do it. Like the luxury brand founder of Brunello Cucinelli, he sort of tries to embody his philosophy. I think it's like humanistic philosophy or something he calls it. Oops.
One of the things that came up for me there, and I can relate to your struggle about reading a biography of someone and starting again and again. I read that biography when I was 23, and so I aspired. Here's somebody who's this great person. What do I know at that age? One of the things I'm hearing in what you're describing, I think, is the idea of the books that I'm drawn to reading are those who provide a path for self-learning and elevation. Mm-hmm. And I think about this as about art as well. The idea of the things that I take in, the things that I would like to create, the things I would prefer to have as my cultural diet, my cultural nourishment, to be that which provides an example of how I can attain a higher self. And in hearing your description of the challenges with reading about some of the hypocrisy within Jobs in his life, it almost sounds like, what do you gain from reading about someone who doesn't seem to be aligned with the values that you aspire to embody?
Yeah, I think that's a very well put. With every single one of us, there are good things in us and there are bad things in us. There are certain demons that persist throughout your life. And there's things that one can learn from Steve in terms of his dedication, right, to being a craftsman, and the way he saw the company he was building and sort of the long-term vision that he had of the company. I think there's something praiseworthy of. Sort of, I say that with a caveat that it's mainly that because we live in a very compartmentalized world where what I am at work and what I am at home and what I am as a friend to you are three separate things, that one can say, I'm going to be a total douchebag at work, and I'm going to mistreat people, I'm going to abuse them, whatever it is, right? But then when I come home to my wife, I'm the most loving. To my daughter, I'm the most caring, and to my friend, I'm the most faithful of a friend. I stick to my word, and I don't try to undercut you. But at work, I'll undercut you. I'll try to get around you and try to get the best deal, whatever it is, right? The compartmentalization in one's life, we sort of exist in the West, and I think globally now, because culture has become homogenized because of globalism, right? So like there's things that you and I do that people in India are doing because of the internet, because of YouTube, because of Facebook, Twitter, and obviously migrations that are happening. That this idea of compartmentalization is completely at odds with what is in what, say, the Buddha teaches on how you should live, or what the way that Jesus teaches, or within when you're reading in the Bhagavad Gita when Krishna's telling Arjuna, none of this matters. You have a duty to do this. This is your work. You can't just remove yourself from your responsibility. That compartmentalization doesn't exist, and to be, I guess the point of life, if the point of life is to be renowned by your society, by your culture, by your colleagues, then there's a certain way you can go about doing things, right? But that's not necessarily at odds with living a life that is consistent, and living a non-compartmentalized life, where who you are at work, how you show up at work, how you show up with your friends and your family, is the same Mick over and over again, and there is no divorce that happens between Mick. Right? Mick is not this schizophrenic, split personality with different things, and that's why, for like with Confucius, when he says, this is book 2, book 4, it's like one of my favorite quotes from the Analects. It says, "From 15, my heart and mind was set upon upon learning. From 30, I took my stance. From 40, I was no longer doubtful. From 50, I realized the propensities of Shan, which is the way. From 60, my ear was attuned. From 70, I could give my heart and mind free rein without overstepping the boundaries." And the last part is like, from 70, what his heart and his mind desired were no longer misaligned with what is good and what is morally right. And that is a life of, that is a non-compartmentalized life, right? The only way you get there is when all the things you do, the way you act, are all aligned. And part of the struggle is with Jobs is the sort of misalignment that I see, and perhaps I'm not reading him in the most generous light as I could, and that would be my own fault.
What about for you? How do the many sides of you work together, and how do they clash?
It was most obvious to me that I had different sides, and that my life was compartmentalized when 6-7 years ago I'm writing on the problem of evil, and the existence of God, and whether the existence of evil, the suffering, whether that's animal suffering, human suffering, natural suffering, undermines the existence of God. And this is a debate that's been going on for like thousands of years. And sort of like I wade into this debate, writing my thesis on it, and I'm sort of speaking abstractly about these ideas, right? And I'm saying, look, to me, and this my idea is not necessarily unique to me. It's just I was trying to synthesize Islamic philosophy, Christian philosophy, and borrowing some from Jewish philosophy. And so I was trying to synthesize it. And my point that I was making, or the argument I was making, was when you understand what evil is, right, metaphysically and ontologically, you understand it, you realize that it is impossible. It's a non-starter to whether it undermines the existence of God. And obviously the way I expound on God is not the way most people would think about God. Most people think, okay, God is this person in the sky, a king who has rules and edicts that he passes, and he's kind of like looking at you microscopically, like, hey, how's Mick living his life? Or how is IG living his life? It's this God, like the ultimate reality, like the Brahmin. If I'm to use Hindu Advaita language here, like the Brahmin, ultimate reality. And so, anyways, I write this whole thing, right? And in the middle of it, my we find out that my son has a heart disease, and he's in the, you know, through an ultrasound, and we're like, okay, this heart disease is rare. We'll have to have an operation when he's born. And with each subsequent visit to the doctor, it gets worse and worse. And at 36 weeks, so 4 weeks before my son is born, he has a heart attack in the womb and dies. And so we go to a hospital, and my wife gives birth, and I don't know if you can hear. Oops, I don't know. Can you hear my daughter? She just came back. And now I'm holding my son in my arms, cold body. And I realized then that what I had been writing about is now confronting me in my face, right? And that's when I realized, up until this point, everything that I was speaking about, for the most part of my life, it was this abstract, intellectual, academic, divorced, nothing really challenged me. And it was challenging me intellectually. Like, I had to come up with like unique ways of argumentations, but it wasn't challenging. It wasn't confronting me existentially. And that's when I realized, okay, either I have to embody. Oh, first of all, do I believe what I've just spent hours and like a year researching, right? Or was it just a ploy? Was it just like an intellectual flirtation that I was having? And so that was, for me, that was like the biggest challenge. And that took, years for me to come to grips with. And that's part of the reason why I'm very much convicted and emphatic about embodying one's life and embodying one's belief, because I know what it's like to not do that, because I know what it's like to be in the midst of it and go, oh shit, maybe I don't actually believe these things. And if I don't, then I am a hypocrite, and I am one who has not lived a life of virtue, because really I'm all talk, no action. And that switch, right, that flip that I had to make was, it was very important for that to happen. Like the Sufis say, it is only through suffering that your self will be burnt. It is only through the fire of suffering that your ego is destroyed, and you truly understand what it means to live. You truly understand what it means to embody the beliefs that you have, right? You can no longer be a bird without wings squawking around on the ground. You have to actually take flight. So I mean, all that to say, it's a continual process for me, right? To everything that I'm reading, everything I'm sort of speaking, I do my best to say things that I am doing myself. Like, I would never speak about doing silent retreats and the importance of silence if I've never done it myself. If I don't know the struggle of like sitting down and having to sit still for like, hour, 2 hours, 3 hours without moving, I wouldn't say to somebody, you should do this at least once, right? Because that would just be me being very pretentious and being a fake. And I think that's the last thing that I want to do.
There's something so profoundly life challenging about that type of dedication to sincerity and to pursue these questions, to be forced to confront them, and almost to be the one who, perhaps because it is in a twisted way, because you are capable of integrating them, of being forced to be the one to share, to experience it, and then to share out. The tragedy you shared about your son and the work that you were doing, there's a very twisted experience there of the thing that you're studying is the thing that you've encountered, the biggest questions that you had to then contemplate even more deeply, and this time so viscerally. What do you feel around the responsibility of, if you're predisposed to and you're dedicated to following this path of these types of questions, of giving that to others. You're creating in public the work that you do, the podcast that you're doing, you're synthesizing something, and you're not just taking it for your own journal. There's a reason you're doing it publicly. And I'm wondering if that relates to some of the responsibility or prerogative you feel around, if this is the thing that you can singularly do, this is what you can bring back to others.
It certainly is it feels like a mission to help others embody their beliefs, to have convictions, and to have convictions around what they believe and why they believe, and not simply to be an intellectual about it, and to at least be of some help in whatever minor scale, when somebody listens to my podcast or if somebody reads my Substack, right? To say, okay, to remind them that it's crucially important. I guess I'm using crucially and importance. It's crucial to really spend time reflecting and contemplating on what you think are most important to you, and then confronting that as raw as possible. And one of the ways, and I think we talked about this before, maybe like not last time, but maybe one before that, the importance of confronting one's own mortality. And there are two, I guess one of three ways, but the two main ones are like of truly asking yourself whether what you're doing is a projection of somebody else's ideas upon you, or if it's an internal projection, right? And that's suffering is, there's a reason why lots of mystics and lots of different religions talk about suffering, and why suffering is a key point into breaking your ego and annihilating your ego. It's that when you suffer, you have nobody else. Like, the suffering that happens is usually inside. Obviously, you can have physical ailment, and that is suffering, but the suffering, even if you have physical ailment, is happening internally. Like, you are the one. Nobody else has experienced that physical ailment on your behalf, right? And so there are two ways. One of three ways. The first one is you choose that suffering yourself, right? You go into that journey yourself, and that's the path of Itlaq for the Sufis. You practice breathing and fasting, and through that they conjure up mental suffering. Or through the Desert Fathers within the Christian mystic tradition, same thing. You go into the desert, you abandon, you say no to family, you say no to everything, and you go live in the desert for as long as possible, and you confront the rawness of the desert, the demons in the desert. So you can actively choose to do that, and I think that's like the way that I would like people to confront it, versus the way that I have gone through and other people have gone through. It's like you get cast into it, and when you get cast into it, you don't really have, you're sort of like falling from a cliff, and you're trying to figure out how to fly, and you don't know if you're actually going to make it, right? If you don't figure out how to fly, you're going to hit the ground, and that's going to be the end of you. And that's like the last thing I think I would want somebody to go through, is to go through that, not of their own volition. I think it's much better if you go through of your own volition to go through this confrontation of your mortality, to go through the mental suffering, and have I been relying on the strength of others, for example, for me to endure the whatever else, right? And like, is there a way for me to overcome my existential dread, my existential anxiety, the complete sadness I feel around your state in life, or the situation you're in? Do I have the strength to overcome? And I do think we all have the strength to overcome these things, but it takes a tremendous amount of work. And it's much better to do that work ahead of time through minor daily small practices, right? Whether that's like small meditation prayers, doing like small, making sure you keep your word, and making sure that you are, at least for me, the way practicing virtues, and if you say you're a religious person, let me just say, and it's like the importance of love. Like love is the most important thing, but you're an absolute human garbage when it comes to like treating other people, then you're not really practicing. But if you continue putting these into action in the small minor ways, when the large thing comes, then you feel confident. Just like courage, right? A lot of people want to be courageous when something big happens, and like, okay, if I see a woman getting beat up on the street, then I'll stand up for them. But really, a lot of people don't do that. They'd rather just pull out their phone and film this event happening instead of putting their life at quote unquote risk, to protect this woman. But if you have implemented small steps throughout your whole life, throughout the whole year of being courageous, then when the moment calls, you can rise up to that. And that's the way I how I see the podcast as, like, it's like trying to help, I should say, those who are listening. It's like, okay, you can do this. So when the moment comes, you're not faltering. Like I felt like I was like falling without any guidance. That's what I felt like years ago, right?
To be who you are, what have you willingly let go of, and what have you had to sacrifice?
I've certainly lost friends, good friends, as I was figuring all these things out. Friends who, expected me to be one way, to think one way, and then when I stopped thinking one particular way, and these are friends who I thought were good friends, right? That I say that with sadness, because to me, a good friend is one who doesn't abandon you in the midst of your suffering. I realize that you will know who your good friends are when you suffer, and that's the only time you're going to know who your good friends are. In the joys of life, when you're flying high, you think you have lots of friends. You think somebody's your good friend, and then when you're suffering, when you're in the down, in the dirt, in the sewer, some friends just, it's too much for them, so or they don't know what to say, and so they think the best thing to do is just like completely detach themselves, and so they don't have to journey with you through, right? Because it is a tremendous calling to be a friend, because if you're a good friend, you will stick with somebody and help share that burden with them, right? And the other one is, to be who I am, there are things that I have had to rework and understand, and really inspect, right? And one of them being the way that I understood God and the way that I understood suffering. Because intellectually, I had assented to this idea that, suffering is part of existence, which it is. But for me to actually embody that and say, okay, existentially and experientially, I am in agreement with this, meant that there were certain beliefs that I had, beliefs around, for example, speaking up for what I believed in, right? When I'm in conversation with friends around, whether it's like doctrinal or not doctrinal specific, but theological, religious things, where for me to say, I think this is probably the first time I'm saying this publicly, but for me to say, there is only one truth, but there are different manifestations of that truth, like a very perennialist sort of take, has made me an outcast within certain circles of friends that I had. Friends that I would have, philosophical, theological, religious, political, what like the conversations that you have when you're like with friends, you can talk about on. Friends have gone, well, you can't say that, but to me, it's I have to be one IJ Makan in all my life, right? I can't be partially me here with you and then be fully with somebody else and then be partial in somebody else. Like, Doesn't mean that you aren't like wise and discriminating in what you talk about, but insofar as amongst friends, right, amongst people you trust. And when somebody asks you, like you asked me this question, I told you my answer. Not like what I said was really any controversial. I mean, it is controversial within certain circles, but to say that, and for me to be able to say this now and say, yeah, this is what I believe. There's only one truth, and the truth is manifested in different forms, in different times, in different cultures, in different languages, and that obviously made me lose some friends, unfortunately. And taking stance on particular things like doing the podcast and the painting, it's sort of like I have to have enough conviction that, okay, this is something that I want to do, and those convictions only happen because of the years of work that I've sort of put in. It's like, okay, this is the conviction that I have. One of the things that I had given up in terms of beliefs is this idea that somebody or some group has a monopoly on truth, right? Obviously, just going like that. That is a belief that I have given up, because I used to think there's only like certain groups or people have the truth. Everybody else has half truths or no truths at all. And giving that up was, I would say, probably one of my more difficult things that I had to do, to go, okay, I actually don't think this is the case anymore. More so me changing and understanding better, at least the way I see it, having a better grip. Then I was like, okay, I don't think this is correct, but it also comes with a lot of repercussions.
Where did you find the strength to sacrifice those things? And some of it is, maybe you can go into a little bit of detail. It's surprising to me that there was sufficient controversy in your social circle about either your vocational path or your outlook on a personal belief and orientation around the world, to the world.
I think, Mick, that probably has to do with just the sort of like the circle that I was, but that I'm close with, and like philosophically oriented and much more in depth oriented in terms of like the depth of the friendship. What I would have considered the depth of the friendship was much more philosophical and spiritual / theological, cultural, whatever it is. But it was just deeper, and so it was as if I became a heretic, which some certain people will paint me as a heretic, for certain of my beliefs. And they're like, okay, this guy's a heretic. He was my friend, but now he's a heretic. We have to burn him at the stake. But instead of burning me at the stake, they cast me out of the group. And that's a whole different journey to figure out, right? If you grew up with a community, or not even just a community, like a circle of friends that you had, and then you got cast out, you no longer have that same sort of security is probably not even the right word to use here. Comfort of friendship. Now you have to make new friends. Now you have to try, not as much as possible, try to salvage some friendship, but while not abandoning yourself and not abandoning your convictions. And in those situations, there are some friendships that I would say have remained partially with like just an ongoing dialogue, right? And that's the way friendship should be. Like you and I, have certain beliefs that we have about this world. It's very possible in like 25 years, certain things that we'll no longer believe in, but that's the whole point of life. And that's the whole point of living and learning. And that it's this continuous journey. And so to me, this idea of being cast out as a heretic, and this is not just like, this can happen within any other circle, right, that one is involved in. That's a very painful, it's very hurtful as a human being. It hurts you. And you're like, man, I thought that no matter what we discussed and what I believe, unless my ideas were completely immoral and I was advocating for, some immoral act against humanity, then yeah, I would understand why one would cast out a friend like that. Or at least instead of casting them out, you should try to correct them. But this time it wasn't even a correction. It was like, you're wrong. You have to think this way. If you don't think this way, you can't be part of our group, without saying that.
As you're describing this, it's helped me clarify something for myself just now. I've now realized that there's an overlap, but it's not 100% of seeking and belonging. Because if you're seeking, you're looking for answers. At some point, you could find belonging. That belonging could hold you back from continuing to seek. How What sort of conflict have you had between being yourself and belonging? And I think you just answered that from one perspective. Is there more to that?
Man, that's
I'm sure there's more to it.
Once again, a great insight and question. You should do this thing called podcast, Nick. Yeah, that's an excellent way of putting it. I think I might use that from now. The sort of dichotomy between seeking and belonging, and I think that's why the early monastics within the Christian tradition, right? They left their cities and they went into the desert and lived in caves and were very persistent that people don't visit them, right? Even if their status as being a holy man, as a wise woman, were passed into the cities and that people came out and sought after them, they would try to wall themselves up in the caves, and people would have to break down the walls to try to talk to them. They're like, I have to talk to you, and there's some sense in which for them it seemed almost that, the reason why they did it is they saw their life as a sacrifice to help save the city that was becoming ungodly. Let's just put it that way. And so for them, it was like a sense of sacrifice. But at the same time, it also meant that they had to abandon their belonging, their group, their tribe, to become a seeker of this mystical union with the divine, with the ultimate reality. And for the most part, it is a dichotomy. It is only insofar as one does not belong to, say, a sangha or a monastery, or like a community of Sufis or whatever it is, right? Because those guys, they all have the same goal. They're all seekers, but all the seekers are getting together to seek after this thing. Whereas oftentimes in our urban landscape, one could be a seeker, but he's not surrounded by seekers. His friendships aren't necessarily seekers, especially if one becomes and starts to have sort of like this realization while they're studying, while they're meditating, while they're praying. They're like, oh, maybe I'm doing this wrong, and I'm trying to voice this so that I can work through it out. And you say it to this group that you feel like you belong to, and then the group goes, you know what? Sorry, Mick, you're not part of us anymore. You said the wrong things and you're out. And now you no longer have that. So then you have to seek out that community. But in an urban landscape, that's much more difficult to do unless you abandon the city and join a monastery or join a sangha or whatever it is.
You're not on the outskirts. You're not in the cave, though. You're a family man, right. And you have a outward-facing semi-public life, rather than a monastic within a cave. Your answer earlier helped me add new depth to this curiosity of, if we think of ourselves as, or if we acknowledge ourselves as primates who evolved growing up in groups, the overlap of different relationships, of what are the relationships that you rely on to balance or complement you? And also, and that includes the antagonism of those relationships. Because I think what you just defined, like, I'm defining myself as being not that. How has that balance, complementarity, or antagonism helped you become more yourself?
So your two questions. The first one being, like, in terms of grounding, obviously my wife, I think I'm very lucky and blessed to have this woman in my life. Through all the things that we've been through, like, she has been the one who has not given up on me, the one who has pushed me, the one who has made me be more honest with myself, and not to simply abandon something because it's hard, like simply join a group, or remain in the group just to belong, right? She said, look, you have these convictions, I want you to work them out, And to have somebody like that in my life is a tremendous blessing that I cannot understate. Because then it allows you to go, okay, even if I'm working through all these ideas and like I'm struggling with trying to understand all these, like I'm sort of like reworking my metaphysical outlook. My wife, the one who I've committed my rest of my life with, right, till death do us part, she will not abandon me, right? And she is here with me. Yes, you can have disagreements as you're talking through, but she will not abandon me in this life. That is a sense of security that obviously is not present in somebody who doesn't have that. I have my wife to thank for much of my strength. So that, makes a difference. And then, yes, the sort of dichotomy between being in the city, but also me not being a monastic, a monk. It certainly is tempting. It's like, oh man, if I was single, I could see myself becoming a monk. And spending the rest of my life as a monk. But obviously, I'm not. I'm not that. I am married, and I don't want to be a monk because I want to be here with my family. One of the things that's been helpful, as we talked about previously in the beginning, is having those implementations of certain practices and rituals, like just meditative, whether it's meditative or like silent retreats, or having practices that are, to me, spiritually enriching, has allowed me to exist within the urban setting without going up. I'm going to throw all this apart and let's go find a monastery and maybe they'll take maybe they'll take married monks or something. Yeah. And having friends to speak to about these things, like you and I have spoken about these things. It's very helpful to know that there's somebody else who doesn't necessarily have to think the same way you do, but is ascertaining or contemplating on the same sort of depth that you are trying to contemplate on questions. The answers doesn't have to be the same, of course, and the expressions will likely be different. But to know that there's somebody else, and to know that there are other people, doing this, it's comforting, but also it makes you go, it's possible to do this in an urban setting, right? And if this is obviously a very, very optimistic outlook on my part, if everybody implemented some of these things from the advice and the wisdom from these men and women throughout history, the wise men and women throughout history, the world would be a much more loving and peaceful place. I obviously fully aware I'm not the one. It's not like I'm the first one to say this. Like people have said this throughout time and culture, but I think there's some truth to that, and to sort of be a light in that sense of like, hey, you can do this too. Like, you don't have to pick between being a monastic and being an urbanite, right? Not not that being a monk is anything wrong with it, but it's very important to say what this the what they're doing here. Yeah, to the same extent, you can't do it. Now you can't spend 12 hours a day meditating every 4 days. You might not be able to do that, but you could spend 5 minutes to 15 to 20 to 30 minutes a day praying or meditating early in the morning, late at night, right? Or like somewhere in between. So it is possible. I think it's just certainly it certainly feels overwhelming to somebody who's never done it. And you're like, oh, yeah, that's a life that life of like to use Joseph Pieper's term here, that life of leisure is out of reach for me, because that's only for monks. That's only for the sannyasis.
A couple weeks ago, I shared a link about In Pursuit of Silence with you, and I was listening to the interviews with the filmmaker afterwards, and he mentioned how making the film was itself that journey of exploring more of this for himself. It was a theme he was drawn to previously, and it was an opportunity for him to, over the course of 3 years, to keep experiencing it so much more, discovering it, going into it, and that he didn't want to be a monk. He wanted to incorporate into his daily life, and there's a role for that too. Of if one of the concepts I'm trying to play with very heavily over the last several years is, I like to think of it as, if I invoke X and Y as its complement, then by by referencing Y, I'm automatically invoking X. And so I can't say, oh, I don't want to do X. Like, I'm a monastic, the monastics exist because of the city. So what would be beyond the two of them, beyond the inseparable duality of that? And you mentioned earlier about how, as you were pursuing this path, or I should say, as you were pursuing your path, the continuation that you've been on for a while, you found yourself isolated from people you knew before. And this, I didn't consider that angle previously, and I was curious, and this adds so much more depth to I think how I was trying to craft this question initially, of how have you prevented your work from isolating you? Because, and the way I thought about it initially was, aspiring to higher ideals can make you inaccessible, and it can make you want more from your relationships, new, or you also have a higher threshold for the new ones that you let in. So, and especially from existing, like the expectations. So you've covered the portions where you've been forced, either from an internal repulsion or from receiving the repulsion, forced away from other past relationships. I'm curious, since then, how you've focused on preventing your pursuits from isolating you. Because ultimately, I think what you're pursuing is union.
Yeah, you, you don't want to be quite like the some of the Buddhist monks who have the take the path of the rainbow journey. I believe that's what you call it. Where you can choose to annihilate your physical body and you're gone, and you only leave behind your hair or maybe certain pieces of items. It certainly is that union that you mentioned. That is continuous throughout the traditions, right? That's whether that's Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, right? It's all of them, and that I wouldn't say that's even an exaggeration to say all of them. They're all speaking about the union with the ultimate reality or the ultimate self, right? Where certain Christians just still say God, Islam, Muslims will say Allah, but you can get caught up in trying to seek the union by abandoning your current responsibilities. And so there's for example, Nevid Ergin, in his book The Path of Annihilation, the Sufi Path of Annihilation, he sort of makes the point that you should embrace the familial life. You should embrace your work. You should embrace doing the things that you consider normal, because it is in doing these things that you are going to be in union. But the moment you think that what you're doing is not important, and then you have to seek something else to do these things, that's usually when you don't find it. I put a little asterisk there with the monks. The monastic life is different, because you do have to sell all your belongings. You have to say, I'm not returning to work. I'm not returning to, you have to do that. But the point that Ergin makes is, you should embrace everything that you're doing as equally important, because it's only when you have that understanding that you are now living out the beliefs that you have. And that's something Thich Nhat Hanh also speaks about, right? The Zen Buddhist. One of his stressing points is, you have to be present. That's obviously, I'm sort of repeating and paraphrasing what he's saying, but you have to be present in every single moment that you do. And that's why it's known as the father, the godfather of the mindfulness movement, where he's like, you have to, when you're eating, you have to be fully present, in the food that you're consuming. When you're walking, be fully present in the steps that you take, in the conversation that I'm having with you. I'm as much as possible. I'm trying and attempting to be fully present in this conversation, such that it should get to a point where you don't necessarily completely lose track of time, but you're so absorbed in the moment that that moment becomes the only real thing. And to me, that's been very helpful as a. I'm weary to use the word framework because I don't really see it as a framework, but an aphorism. I don't know what it would be. Maxims to go. Yeah, you don't have to abandon your life to find union. You can find that union here in the now, in this present moment. And that was a big realization for me. And it was like maybe a few years ago that I was like, because I was like, oh, maybe I have to go somewhere else, especially in the early days of like my silent retreat. It'd be like, okay, I have to go somewhere else to be in that space. But I realized, oh, that space can exist here, right? I don't have to travel to a monastery. Obviously, I very much enjoyed going to the monastery. It was the first time going to a monastery, but I don't have to go there. And so that, I think that's a way for me to answer your question very straightforwardly, to not allow my work to divorce me from reality, because all the work, it seems, points back to this mystical union that it seems everybody ends up seeking either early on in their life or very much close to the end of their life, and that you read of from people who are close to death, right? The people like there's a book that I did, Paul Kalanites, the Stanford neurosurgeon, right? He has the book Breath Becomes Air, and he talks about how his whole life he had sought to confront mortality, and then he realized only in the midst of his own mortality that, oh, I haven't actually confronted my own on my own death. And then so he does, and when he does, he realizes the things that are most important to me, the things that I had held dear to, the status that I was after, these prizes and these national awards that I got, man, these are all meaningless. The most meaningful thing to him was being able to hold his daughter. And he has that little letter at the end of that book. He says, I hope you know, to his daughter, when somebody asks you, what have you contributed to this world? I hope you know that you've contributed to the happiness of this man's life. And that was like, I'm obviously trying, I don't want to tear up here, but that was a very powerful moment for him in realizing, yeah, all of this, he's like one of the youngest, most prestigious neurosurgeon. It goes, it's the love that I have for my daughter, who he only gets to experience for like 8 months, I believe. That, in it, he found the love, that mystical union, and that understanding of this like universal. I'm sort of using this ethereal, mystical language here, but this like ephemeral, this ultimate love, sense of love that he experienced right at the end of his life.
We've spoken a lot about the things that you've been drawn to, the mystics, the books, the ways of exploring piety and contemplation. And I'm curious, all of those are you moving towards the beauty, the true. What have you learned about yourself through the things that irk you or disturb you or repulse you?
Things that disturb me about myself, right? Or just irk me in general as a whole.
Yes.
Okay. One of the early things that I learned, getting married, was you think you're not selfish until you get married. You're like, oh my goodness, I'm absolutely a selfish dog. Everything is oriented around myself, and that irks me, and that's something, I think that's a continual slaying of a demon of selfishness. And so that's certainly one thing. The other thing that sort of irks me is my impatience towards somebody who will easily discredit another because they're not uh, intellectual enough, or they don't have the right credentials. and that irks me to my bone. But over the years, I've sort of like become much calmer and tamer in not allowing this frustration, because I think um, when you read the works of these wise sage, these men and women, a lot of them don't have the same education, quote unquote, right? The formal education, but we're out here reading them, and they've been reading them for hundreds of thousands of years. And then for somebody to come along and say, actually, make, you don't have a PhD in comparative religion, you can't talk about these things, or you don't have a PhD in, analytic philosophy, you can't talk about whatever. And it's like, well, how do you know that what Mick is saying is not closer to the truth than you are, simply because you disagree with the linguistic synthesis, whatever it is? Anyways, that's something I'm very much aware of in myself that I can do to other people. But and because of that, I know when somebody else is doing it to somebody else, right? Um, the flaws that you see in others are the flaws that exist in you, right? And that's certainly a flaw that exists in me. One of the things in terms of like what irks me in general is the sort of short term perspective we have of the world, as agents in the world, and also as a group of agents within companies, and the sort of very short term thinking that we have. It's, I think, man, why is it that we're so caught up in these short term profitabilities at the expense of sustainability in the long term, like at the expense of sustainability, whether that's within the ecosystem or whether that's a company's health or people's health? Wouldn't the world would be a much better place if at least all of us tried to be much more long term viewing and much more long term minded, and saying, okay, these actions that we take, we're not going to take them simply because we have to impress our shareholders, but we know that 10 years from now, it's going to be very important. Like thinking the way, say, I'm being very generous here, but say Rolex things, or say some of the Japanese companies, they have 30,000 companies or shops in Japan that are older than 100 years old, which isn't just like over 100 years old. It's like, what are they doing differently? Obviously, the thing they're doing differently is they're very long term minds, and they're sort of dedicated to that pursuit of excellence in not just in the craft, but in the way they think about it, right? The only way you can think about excellence is if you think about it in a long term perspective. Like, all the skill sets that you have, Mick, has come over a long span of time. And if you tried to compress all of it in like a month, good luck with that. I'm sure it's possible for some people, but good luck, I would say. It's trying to be like Mick in under a month. So yeah, I guess those are like the three things that irk me personally about myself, and like outwardly about the world. And obviously you already know this, but what irks me is like some of the ugliness that exists in cities and in art, that grinds my gear.
When have you felt understood?
I feel like, not to toot your horn too much, but some of the questions that you have sort of responded to, whether those are like modification of questions that you previously had. Like there's questions that you, for example, about the closest one in my head, like the seeker and the belonging. I feel like for you to have asked that question required a level of understanding and listening that aren't always present in other conversations as a whole. So like that like right now, that would be an example. Another one would be when I was speaking to a friend about art, about why I think that most modern art are nihilistic in nature, and I think that is detrimental to the collective conscious experience of humanity, and that we should find ways to recover art as a lens through which one's soul can be nourished. As I was, and sometimes I think maybe I'm crazy. Maybe it's just me thinking these things, and sort of speaking to a friend, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I mean, I could totally see this." And I was like, "Oh wow, I guess yeah." And I felt understood there because they were able to engage in me in a meaningful manner. So anytime I've had a conversation where the other person has engaged in that conversation in a way that I haven't thought about, but it's within that context, right? Versus we're talking and you go, IJ, that's wrong. This is how you should think about things. Then I feel like, well, you haven't really understood me, right? And there's a quote in from Ender's Game, and the main character says something, and I'm paraphrasing here because I can't remember what the phrase is, but he says something like, when you fully understand your enemy and understand who they are and their intentions and wants and desires, then that's when you love them. And that's like at the point where you don't want to kill them because now you fully understand them and you love them because you understand who they are and all their intentions. When I read that, I was like, man, that is a level of, that requires a sense of death to the ego, right? For me to step into your mind, into your thinking, to say, okay, let me shed my ego, my egoic, prideful self of like trying to one up Mick or something, and to really sit inside of your mind and say, okay, I see why he's saying this way. Yeah, so any time that's happened, I would say I felt most understood.
When you first mentioned in the very beginning that you were studying evil and then you experienced it, my assumption was you experienced evil at the hands of someone else.
Mm.
And when you shared the details of the tragedy, I understood more depth to what you're describing as evil. And one of the thought experiments I've had has to do exactly with the Ender's Game quote of, if I understand, if I unwind someone back enough through the confluence of circumstances of where they were born, who they've encountered, their experiences, it would make reasonable sense that they've taken the most recent decision that I'm characterizing as evil. But I'm not sure if that's how accurate that is. And I'm wondering if you've encountered, to what extent you've been able to apply that quote for yourself, especially when you've encountered malevolence through a person.
I think there's always a sense of agency that I don't want to undermine. I think humans, no matter what circumstances that they're under, they still have the agency to act otherwise. If that were not the case, then I would be removing responsibility from people, and that sort of goes against what I believe in and also what I read in books, and you've also read in books, right? It's like there's always a sense of agency that you cannot remove, because the moment you remove the agency, then somebody will say, well, I'm doing this because I can do no other, right? To totally use Martin Luther quote out of context, I stand here and I can do no other. Even when you understand somebody's motivations as much as possible, and they acted a particular way, say in a malevolent manner, I think it's both right to be sympathetic towards why they did it because of the previous sort of influencing factor, but also not let them off the hook if it is malevolence. Like, you still had that agency to not act this way, and it is through realizing that agency that you can make the changes that are necessary. Because obviously, for a while, philosophically, I was a determinist, but it's called like compatibilist, right? The idea that you have free will, but you're fully determined. It's called the compatibilist movement, which I don't hold to. But I know at one point, I thought maybe I don't have free will at all. This is like over 10 years ago. But the more I thought about it, it's like, yeah, it actually doesn't make sense. Even just the way that I'm able to reflect on my thought about whether I have free will, it requires a sort of agency and to reflect and to change my mind.
We spoke about understanding and unraveling someone. Could they, and you've mentioned like someone can make a different choice in that. They're not fated to just behave as they did at that point. And I want to explore that from another perspective for you, from misunderstanding. what about impactful times, the most impactful time that you've been misunderstood?
I certainly would be around the time when my metaphysical assumptions were going through a reworking phase, where I was trying to express ideas that are clear in your head, as it always is, right? Your ideas are very clear and sharp in your head, but then the moment you express it to somebody else, you're in for a lot of misunderstanding and um, misquotations. And so, like those, I look back sometimes and say, man, the friendships that I lost, I wonder if I would have lost them if I was better at expressing myself, right? If I was better at articulating my thoughts. But yeah, I think about that. And so I try my best. And, I fail continually at articulating as succinctly and as accurately what I'm thinking and what I'm trying to say to you. But I do think the times that I've been misunderstood are either because I have not done a good job at expressing my thoughts, or the other person has willingly not given me the grace to try to understand and try to shape my position in a um, more holistic manner, and said, "Oh, this is what you're saying, so I'm just going to take it and run with it."
That doesn't sound like a curious approach. That there wasn't curiosity expressed about there, and certainly not a positive intent. Can can you share an example of someone of any species
Mm-hmm.
expressing curiosity about you?
Expressing curiosity about me, I don't. I've never thought about that question, so I don't. I I I cannot think of an example. I guess it would depend on how I'm understanding curiosity. Because dogs always, that would be the dogs are always curious. An example would be babies. I've always found that either it's because I look different than lots of the babies that I'm around, that they're either repulsed by me at first, and then by the end of the afternoon, they're like, we're having a great time, or they're like automatically drawn to me because either look like their dad or their uncle or whatever. But it's always um, with any new baby experience, with not my own child, but like strangers' babies or friends' babies, it's always one of those things. I'm like, wow, it swings one of two ways, for at least for me.
You mentioned that the babies who are initially uh, not drawn to you at by the end of the afternoon, they enjoy you very much. So it sounds like you have a very playful side. Can you share more about that? The your ability to be silly or to cause a bit of mischief?
Hmm. I'm sure the mischief part is something that is much less prominent in my life. But when I was in boarding school, I was suspended multiple times for essentially breaking rules and being mischievous. And so it's always, but those are more notorious activities. And so with children, it's more so I to me, children are one of the most fascinating. Like the state of being a child and a toddler is one of the most fascinating stages in our lives, because it embodies the newness of life, right? That you don't speak the language, you don't have the concepts, but it also is foreshadowing the state in which you'll come back to when you're very old. You have somebody taking care of you. You might have struggles expressing it, your ideas and your wants, right? It's very much like a baby. Like you're looking at two different spectrums at the same time inside of a baby. I mean, you could see it in the old person first, but like the old person is obviously a fully grown baby, a fully grown human being with all the knowledge of like 60, or like 60, 80 years, but sometimes with the incapacity of a baby to express their emotions and their feelings and their thoughts. So whenever I'm interacting with babies, I'm fascinated with it, and it's much easier to, like, I find that I can more easily be myself with with babies and with very old people. Like those are like the two I've naturally, and I'm sure this is the case with other people as well. And because I find that with the old people, they tend to be less, they tend to have less barriers or less walls up because they've kind of seen the world, they've experienced the horrors or the sadness and the suffering and the happiness much more and much more in depth, that they realize the what is the point of putting up a facade, a face of ruggedness, of nobility, of strength and of power, right? When you're interacting with somebody new, when you're old, you're like, yeah, I'm about to die. I want to enjoy every experience that I have, and so, and I'm sure this is the, other people, when they interact with old people, they find that they could probably be themselves best. And I found that some of the best conversations I have with strangers are almost always much older folks. That's not always the case, but I can go in depth almost immediately. I'll say, I'll give you an example. Somebody that I know is, I think, over 70, retired recently, and we were having a conversation. And I had spoken to him maybe, I think this is probably the second time I'd spoken to him. And he was a professor. He retired and he had gone on the El Camino walk, which is, the very famous Catholic walk that they do for, takes about a month. And he'd come back. We were talking, and I said, I'll just call him Luke. How was your summer so far? And he was like, oh, it was good. I went on the El Camino. I came back and I said, oh, what did you learn while you were walking? He said, well, I realized that my son is not gonna, is by the time he gets to my age, I will no longer be here. And that realization was profound for me because I never really thought about it. And now that I'm back, it was my intention is to be always present with my children and with my grandkids, and to be there with them, because for my career, for all my years and as doing my career, I haven't been there. I haven't been present. And so we talked, right? And that's something that most people wouldn't just talk and share off the front. And so that allowed us to just have the conversation. I was like, yeah, there's a very famous Eastern fable of the man who's chased by the wild boar, right? There's the Eastern fable, chased by a wild boar. He jumps into the well, and then in the well there's a dragon waiting to devour him. And so he's like, oh, so he clings onto to this twig, and then he realizes on the twig there are two mice gnawing away at the twig. He goes, oh my goodness, either I climb out and the boar, stabs me, kills me, or I let go and into the jaws of the dragon, or I just cling onto this life as much as possible and try to lick the dew that's dripping from the twig. And I was mentioning, I was like, yeah, I think lots of people, as Tolstoy, when he retells a story, he says most people are this man, but they don't realize that they're about to die, and they just keep on licking this honey as if this is the only meaningful thing. But you have to understand that you are going to die, and it's only in your understanding of your mortality that everything else in life becomes precious. And obviously I was sharing this with my new friend Luke. He's like, yeah, he's like, yeah, I actually came across that fable years ago, and I've thought about it. And we had this conversation. So point being, that conversation, those types of conversation, I've had much more with people who are much older than people who are similar age to us, because there's always like a sense of, I don't know what it is. There's a facade that's put up, right?
You said something fascinating. Well, you said many things that are fascinating. One of the things that I was drawn to there is that you can be most yourself around little kids and older folks. Who are you? What sides of you are expressed when you're fully yourself and most fully yourself?
I think it's having, obviously with children, you can't have deep philosophical questions with them. But with children, it's like you can get absorbed in their fascination of the simple things, right? The the staring at this blade of grass as if it is the most incredible, discovery, and being able to participate in their fascination is something that I always find incredibly joyful to do, because it's like you're looking at this, or they're playing a game and they're like, this is the most important thing that the game that they're ever going to play, and you're like absorbed in that moment with them. And then with the older folks, it's basically the same thing, except now they realize that they are close to the end of this life, right? They end up reverting back to this childlike fascination again, and realizing that, okay, like my friend Luke, he's like, okay, all these things that I thought important, I realized the most important thing is my time with my grandkids and my son and my other kids. And when you're in that state, it's much easier to have the conversations that are truly meaningful and like filling, I guess, for the soul. You're like, when you have a good conversation, you're like, oh my goodness, I walked away with that conversation with tremendous appreciation for the other person, once because of their honesty, and two because they shared things that I hadn't thought about in a way that I wouldn't have thought about or ever expressed. And there's that sense of like complete involvement in the conversation that's more obvious with older people than necessarily younger people who are, very much about climbing the ladder. And
in the development between the adolescence, the toddlerhood, and being an elder, there are levels of mastery that we aspire towards with body and mind. And I know for you, martial arts is a big area of that, of cultivating that within yourself. And I'm curious, because it is both body and mind, in moments of lapsed mental discipline, what have you discovered about your physical strength and inner violence?
the constant reminder that you have to embrace the animalistic side of you to fully be a whole person. To slay the minotaur, you have to fight the minotaur, right? You have to go into the maze and fight the minotaur, and that requires you actually being violent. And it's only in your embrace of that drama, there's this eternal archetypical playing out of embracing this, of slaying this minotaur. And so with martial arts, the reason I mentioned that is through my training, that was one thing, a lesson that I relearned over and over again, and something that I've come to appreciate much more. Whereas before, I grew up as I wouldn't say like my mother was a very strong pacifist. She didn't allow us to train any martial arts when we were growing up at all. We weren't allowed to watch any violent sports, no boxing, even WWF, which is now WWE. We weren't allowed to watch that because it was too violent. There's blood involved, and there was smashing of heads and like RKOs and all that stuff. And so I grew up sort of a pacifist. But there were moments in my life that I certainly was not a pacifist, right? Moments where I felt I had to intervene. And so I would intervene, but I had no martial art experience, but I would still intervene as a kid, whether for the right reason or for the wrong reason. And so I always viewed violence as this thing that I couldn't control in myself. Like it was this thing that if it comes out, it just can't go back in, right? It was like, and so I always thought this is like something that I have to like shove away in the corner and turn off the lights and pretend it doesn't exist. And then when I started training jiu-jitsu, you're daily getting thrown around and submitted by people who are bigger than you, better than you, faster than you, more athletic. And there comes a point where you've attained the necessary techniques and knowledge to prevent this from happening and to actually put it on to somebody else. But it also requires a sense of you embracing and your willingness to do these things. And to me, that willingness to do harm to somebody else, to my friends, specific to my friends, is still continually something I struggle. And this is like 7 years, 7 years after I've trained. Like, it's still something that I have to, like, every time I train and we're doing like on Tuesdays, for example, like today is a competition round. So it's like an hour of like doing competitive rounds. And so it's not your easy light, it's like very high heart rate. You're sort of going balls to the walls. And even when I competed, and I only competed a handful of times, the thing, people get nervous about losing and about whether they're going to perform. The thing that I worried me most was hurting the other person. I was like, oh man, like I don't want to hurt somebody. And like when I'm, like when I competed the last time, it's like you're choking somebody out. You're like, you feel terrible. Like I feel terrible doing it, but you do it, you win. And so even here, it's like that sense of the continual embracing of the violence allowed me to go, okay, if I reject this part of me, I wouldn't be a good practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But more holistically, if I embrace this side of me that I've sort of hidden away in the darkness, this animal, this minotaur that I've said, oh, you know what? I'll just send a calf in there every now and then so that it can eat something. That I actually have to go in there myself and either slay it or befriend it and pull him out of the cave and become friends with it. So that's the way I see things. It's just sort of like the yin and yang, being the pacifist and also being able to, having the capacity to harm another, to defend another.
I think that ties into, again, the evil that you originally mentioned and this contemplation of the sacred. And does it exist? How can it exist when this other aspect, seemingly it's diametric opposite, or if it's diametrically opposed, then of course it invokes the other. So related to violence, overlapping with violence, and also diametrically opposed to it, simultaneously union and opposites. Where do you encounter the sacred?
There are three places I would say. The one is in the actual, my own spiritual practice that I do in the morning and in the evenings, or when I'm going away to do my silent retreat, like there. Those are some of the most obvious places that I encounter. And very early in the morning, I found, and like when you're awoken at like 3:30 in the morning, and you're like, you start praying and meditating. You're like, oh, this is, previously I would be like, I'm awake at 3:30. Let me go back to bed. But sort of embracing those moments when you wake up at those times, those for sure. And the other place is in a very physically strenuous, when I'm physically straining myself. I've found that in those moments, especially when I'm fully present in that physical strain, like if I'm again, just to use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu here, when I'm training and I know for certain the days when I'm fully present in the training sessions, and the days that I'm not, and the days that I'm fully present, you lose track in a very sort of mystical way. You lose track of time as a whole, and it's just that one activity that you're doing. And there, even in the violence, even in the all the sweat and the uncomfortability of struggling against another resisting human, I find, because I find there's beauty in this thing. In that beauty, I've often found that when I'm fully present, there's a transcendental experience that takes place. And this is not new to me. Like other practitioners of other martial arts will say the same thing. And And the other time is like when I'm spending time with my family. That when I'm talking to my daughter and she's trying to speak to me, but she can't. She has words, but she can't form sentences properly. And I'm there with my wife and playing with my daughter there. Like that to me is one of the most, if not the most precious times that I have, and times that I'm aware that only exists for 10 years or something, and then my daughter and the rest of my kids will grow up, and then I'm now whatever age I am, and anything that I've not done well with my kids, I can attempt to redeem it through the grandkids, which I think a lot of people do. A lot of grandparents try to redeem themselves through their grandkids.
I'm glad you brought up the language thing. There's a thread here, I think, that connects back to what we discussed earlier about religion, of in having multiple languages and growing up around multiple cultures. I thought about this topic of sometimes the culture or religion or faith that we are closest to, we're too close, and therefore the symbols that within it aren't for us. And whether we go outward, we go elsewhere and try to find a corresponding symbol because that we're able to process through that one, or because we were lacking that symbol within our own culture and there was something that we were trying to understand. I'm curious, what symbols have you incorporated into your life and the meaning behind them within your spiritual path that are from outside your culture? And I leave it to you to define culture because I realize you were at the nexus of so much.
One of them would be my understanding of, like, I growing up in India. India is a majority Hindu country. I had tons of friends of mine that are Hindu, but lots of Hindus in India, just like lots of Christians in North America and in Europe, are nominalist at best, anomalous at worst, and at best are fundamentalist in their understanding, meaning they read their scriptures, or they understand their religion in a very literalist manner, right? There's no sort of like deeper embedded meaning in it, right? And so my experience with Hinduism, for example, was very much on this like exoteric level. I had friends of mine who are Hindus, their parents who are Hindus. I don't think it would be inaccurate to say their understanding of Hinduism is akin to, say, a fundamentalist Christian's understanding of Christianity. So, just to give a brief background on that, for anybody who doesn't, I'm sure people would know fundamentalist Christian, but like fundamentalist Christians tend to be quite opposed to historic Christianity, right, within the Catholic tradition or within Orthodox Christianity, and they're not the same thing, and people tend to conflate those two. But when you study the history of Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity is a very bastard version of Christianity, to put it at best. And the same exists within India, because Hinduism doesn't exist. There's no like one Hinduism. There's multiple different schools. As you know, there are multiple different schools of Hinduism. But within those schools, within all of those schools are levels, right? And the majority of them are fundamentalist in their understanding. Now, I say all this because I always viewed Hinduism as completely opposed to Christianity, right? And as completely opposed. Now, partially because there's not much of a commingling that happens, right? There's you live in peace for the most part with each other, right? During Christmas, Hindus will wish Christians Merry Christmas, and during Diwali, Christians will wish Hindus Happy Diwali, and with Eid and so on and so forth. Like it's a very pluralistic society, and that's the nature of at least the Indus Valley. It's always been pluralistic, and Hinduism itself is pluralistic. Like there is no one Hindu. So my understanding of Hinduism was always like there's this one Hinduism, right? This one Hinduism that I'm aware of through my friends. And then I never really thought about it much afterwards. And what ended up happening was I came across somebody who was talking about Tattvam Asi, the idea that you are, this philosophical understanding within Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, and I was like, man, this is kind of very interesting way, and this is like a year, maybe 2 years ago. I was like, that's not exactly the type of Hinduism that I've come across, that I know, that I've spoken to friends about. So as I, dove more into it, I realized that esoterically there is this underlying similarity within philosophical Christianity, which is what I was doing a lot of my work in: medieval period philosophy and early Christian thought, like early church father thoughts, and the way they express and the way they wrote about God, and the way their understanding of God is if you said this to a normal fundamentalist Christian, they'd be like, "This guy's a pagan. This guy is not part of our Christianity." But then when you read the historic Christianity, they speak about God like, and I say God here as like the ultimate reality, the substrate that holds the existence of all things, and that's the way that philosophically Christians, Muslims, and Jews have understood God. Right? The very famous example is in the Bible, in the Old Testament, which is what Jews, Christians, and Muslims all agree on. When Moses is at the burning bush and he says, "Who are you?" And in the burning bush, God standing here says, "I am." That understanding of "I am," philosophically, that proposition is taken to be "I am," similar to like Tattvamasi, that you are, but this time it's like "I am that which exists." By nature of my essence, I exist, and by my existence, yeah. And this I knew quite well, quite. So when I came across this understanding of Hinduist understand their take on like Tattvamasi, and this idea of the Atman being the Brahman, and that it is through the breaking of the Maya that you find the liberation, right? The moksha. I was like, well, this is crazy. This is like 2 years ago. I was like, well, this is kind of not something I expected. And so the more I studied it, the more I realized I, just like somebody else on the other side, a Hindu that judges a Christian very early, says, "Oh, we're talking about two different gods here," or whatever. When you look at the works of their mystics, of their best philosophers, and their saints, the best saints within the traditions, you find that the language they use, they are different verbs and grammatical, combinations they'll use. But it seems to me, and again, not new to me, other people have noted the same thing, that they are speaking about very similar things, if not the same object. And at first I was very apprehensive about this. I was like, okay, this is kind of nuts. And it's not like I didn't know about perennialist philosophy. It was just when I studied it myself, I was like, okay, I could see why people will be perennialist and actually have conviction around it. And what allowed me to say, okay, this is, I tend to agree with this, or I'm more inclined to agree with this, is because of my experience in having grown up with speaking 3 different languages to 3 different groups, where I could express an idea to you and to somebody else who speaks Manipuri and to somebody else who speaks Tangkhul, the same idea but different times, and I'll probably use a different analogy each time, but the idea is passed onwards. The concepts are passed forth. Yeah, so definitely that was a big advantage for me growing up speaking those languages.
You touched on being able to see things from so many different angles and kind of synthesizing them, unifying them for yourself. I'm curious about when someone else saw something in you that you didn't see enough of, or maybe at all, in yourself.
Probably would be my wife seeing strength in beliefs that she had in me that she could see about myself that I couldn't see about myself, and for her to push me, and encourage me forth. That would be an example. I would say.
How do you bring your full self, these many sides of you, into the art that you do? Because there's this, you take on a very deliberate approach. It's a very, if we think of everything that we do as the output of all of our inputs, the synthesis of the sacred and the pursuits, the questions, the deliberate effort, this pursuit of craftsmanship, and of a dedication to a greater contemplative life. That's one of the major things you channel into the artwork, some of which we can see behind you. I'm curious about the interplay between your artwork and your own spiritual development. In some of your writing, you referenced the notion of rasa, which I was quite drawn to. Can you speak more about that?
I think no art is fully divorced from philosophy. In the beginning, I mentioned about the Impressionists and their influence by empiricism and the idea that the human experience is a tabula rasa, that it's a blank slate. And so there's a very famous line, I think it's by Monet, I could be wrong which Impressionist it was, but he had said that I wish I was born blind and then I was given sight right before the moment I began painting. And the reason he said that was during the 18, I'm trying to remember what it was, it's like 18 something. So during the 1800s sometime, it was the first time, at least first recorded time in the West, that through surgery, a person who was born blind, their optical nerves were connected somehow and they saw sight for the first time. And this was it was sort of breaking news. And one of the most interesting things that came out of it was this person, when they were able to see for the first time, couldn't distinguish between objects. They only saw they only saw values of colors, and so they could look at the table, but they couldn't see table, chair, floor. They just saw one thing, and the Impressionists were fascinated by this, right? And they said, "This is what it is. This is art, And that's why the quote about I wish I was born blind, and then right before I painted, I had this. But I bring that up to say that the way the Impressionists painted is very much influenced by their philosophy, right? Because they're trying to portray that what we see in this world, the things that you and I observe, we don't observe the noumena, the real thing in itself. We only observe the phenomenon of these things, and we're placing values and our own constructions, mental constructions, subjective constructions on these things. And so they're trying to get to the rawness. That's why, that they paint the way they paint. And then you have other movements like the Cubists who are try to get to this understand because they were heavily influenced by like the scientific movement and this idea of the objects in the world don't actually exist. The only thing that exists are these like tiny little atoms, and the point of art is to get to the real state of nature. And that's why the Cubists, they just draw lines and just like blocks of colors, because they're saying, look, we're getting to the real thing. This is the real thing in the world, and this is what we're trying to say. Obviously, I disagree with them. I participated in this years and years ago, where I thought, well, art is then just a subjective interpretation of the world. It's just a subjective expression of my emotions. Like I feel this way, so I'm just going to paint this. But it turns out that is not the case. And even if I'm doing this purely self-expression art work, it's heavily influenced by my metaphysical assumptions about the world. As I began taking beauty more seriously as a universal, transcendental, that I think every human being can ascertain to and can apprehend. I looked at the cities that I've lived in and lamented that our cities are devoid of beauty for the most part, and that every building is competing against another building for attention, right? We architects tend to create buildings so that it looks the most shocking, so that it gets the most attention. And then the cities are like very cubist, not in terms of the art movement, but very like blockwise. And everything about the way we live in the world is influenced by the architects, who I consider an artist in a very particular way. So then I thought, okay, well, how has art been understood historically? And it turns out that there's it's very new, this idea that art is a self-expression, and that art is trying to express this. Art is trying to express something without any subjective value on it, and art has been trying to portray allegorical meanings, and trying to incite in you, to initiate the viewer into something much more profound, and something beyond their infinite experience, right? To draw them into infinity. And art became the portal through which you got initiated. And that's and so the Hindus, not the Hindus, in Indian art, which obviously is Hindu for the most part, there's this idea of rasa, and it's this experience, this aesthetic experience that you have, that requires the viewer to have knowledge, to have sort of like background knowledge, and also for the artist to have that background knowledge, so that when those two things meet, you create a new experience that hasn't existed before. And that requires a lot more thoughtful study of symbols, of philosophies, of objects. I think it's Dostoevsky who said, beauty will save the world. And I am fully convinced of this now. Not when I was studying, and now that I've left academia many years ago, but as I'm reflecting, I do think beauty is what can save the world, and all the hurt that we commit to each other. Right? There's a sense in which I think beauty as a transcendental virtue can elevate the person and help and initiate them into the form. Obviously, I'm kind of using Platonic terms here, but once you see, I guess, to use Adi Shankara's sort of analogy, it's like once you realize that this life is a dream world, and that you've awoken from this dream, when you come back to this dream, you can act in this world in a much more altruistic or much more virtuous manner, because you know that this is your goal here is not to fall in love with the dream world here, right? It's to help people wake up.
Can you separate beauty from falling in love? So if your goal is to follow this, you're trying to embrace and trying to convey the most beautiful and true elements of the world we embody now. Is that misleading?
So again, to use Adi Shankara's analogy, and I think the way he sees it is, this world is real, like the world you and I exist in. He obviously uses the analogy that this is it's a dream, but this world is real, like it's empirically very real, but ontologically it's less real than ultimate reality. So there's have you ever read C.S. Lewis, Mick?
Not enough. I got a collection of his books, and they're on the list.
That's fine. So he has this book called The Great Divorce, and it's a great book. I think anybody should read it, whether they're religious or not. The reason I like it, I like that book, is it's telling the story of people going from one realm to another realm, right? And in one particular part, like one of the characters you follow is this woman who's lost her son, I believe. And there's a bus that comes and that transports these people from the lower realm into the higher realm. And so they travel to this bus, and when the bus stops, the door opens, and she steps out into this higher realm. And when this woman steps out, she's barefoot, so she steps on the grass, and the grass is stabbing her feet. And she's like, "What is happening here?" You know. And she's looking at her hands, and she's seeing that she's looking at herself. And she's not as opaque anymore. She's kind of transparent. But then she's looking at other people in this realm, and they're very real. They're very sharp. The colors are very crisp. And each time she takes a step on the grass, it hurts more. It's like cutting into her, and she cannot understand why. And so, one of the persons in this realm says to her that the realm from which she came from, the lower realm, is less real than this realm. This is the real. This is the truest realm that exists in, and that's why everything is so sharp and everything is so clear, and why you look so transparent is because you're coming from this less real dream state to the real world. And so with the art, the way I see it is any art that's great art does that same thing where it initiates the viewer into two things. It doesn't tell them that this world is an illusion, that it's fake, that Mick doesn't exist here, that I'm not talking to Mick, that my wife doesn't exist, that my daughter doesn't exist. No, it says that no, these are all real, but there's something much ontologically real than all of this, right? And it's trying to point to what the mystics talk about, this ultimate reality, this union with this ultimate reality that you participate in the in this platonic way with the form. So the art becomes a window where it makes you fall in love with this world, to then fall deeper in love with the ontologically realer realer world. And I don't want people to think that I'm talking about heaven, but just ontologically realer.
Can you introduce me to your creativity and imagination?
As we talked about, one of the things that is a constant work in progress is the decompartmentalization of the self and becoming whole. And it's only in becoming whole that you can truly become human. And for me, if I can call it character, is like, if I'm talking about art, for example, before I would just stick to it and divorce the other experiences that I have, right, and only talk about this. But I realized that my love for art, all of it is influenced by everything around me. So each time I'm talking, or like I'm talking about a particular thing, I try to bring all the things into it and try to create a holistic image, so that if you and I, or if somebody else listens to this, they don't walk away with like this one particular aspect and think that this is the only thing that I'm about, right? But and this should be the case for everybody. You want to make sure that somebody else, you want to make sure that you're not portraying yourself as a niche, as like, within business, like, oh, you got to niche down, niche down, niche down. But you want to make sure that you are true to the self true to yourself, by making sure that all of you is present in the aspects. Yeah, that would be my first attempt at answering your question. Yeah, the art that you see behind me, the woman, that is a synthesis of Hindu art, Buddhist art, and Christian art, and Sufi art, or Islamic art, I should say. And I say Sufi versus and Islamic weirdly, because for them, art, you cannot draw faces in art. It can only be Arabic characters. But like the way that a character, to answer your question, try to answer your question better, is I spend a lot of my time studying the different types of art, so that when I actually come and sit down and start ideating on the art, I have like a wellspring that can kind of like pour out. And that's the way I think I generally do. And other people do it differently, but I spend a lot of time like studying, so that when I actually do it, the subconsciously the ideas are embedded in me and it can kind of pour out. And so like this painting behind me, which I don't have a title for yet, but it's like, it's the representation of the death of the ego. And that took the character that, when I was studying it, is, being, your mind is trying to hold pictures of like Christian iconic art, Hindu Rajput art, and then you're kind of like seeing all these Arabic paintings that I have no clue what the Arabic says, and like, the Buddhist icons of their goddess, the Vajra Yogini, and you're trying to synthesize in your mind, and that's the way my character is. That's my character, I guess.
Based on who you are, where you are, how you are today, which of your younger selves are you inclined to hug as a thank you for having lived through it all?
Probably the version of me that went to boarding school when I was 10, and probably that one, because there's lots of people who've been to boarding school. You get dropped off, you're there for 9 months, and then you see your parents for 3 months, and then you're back. So in a span of 10 years, or in a span of 8 years, or whatever, you're only with your family for like 30% at best of your whole life. And that's, 8 years. And so it's like, it's not that many that you're spending with your family. So I think I would hug that version. And would I tell them something? I don't know if I would tell them anything. I would probably just, if anything, I would tell them to embrace the journey that they're on, all the ups and downs that you go through in boarding school. That would be, because obviously without that, there's no version of me that's here talking to you. It's also the part that has had to go through a lot more working on, and the sort of the habits that you pick up in boarding school, you have to shed.
Who are all the people you've yet to be?
Returning to Confucius's writing from in the Analects, is the one who has fully aligned his heart and his mind to what is good. Whether one will actually know when that is the case, or I don't think there's a moment in time that you go, oh yeah, now this is it. Just like there's no moment in time where you go, oh, now I'm enlightened. It was exactly at Wednesday at 1:27. That's when I got enlightened. I don't think there's ever a time like that, but it's this holistic and journey, a path that you go on, that you ultimately, perhaps on the verge of your deathbed, that you realize, okay, now I can say with all my heart that I have what I desire, what I want from my heart, what I'm inclined towards, are all the things that are good in this world, and all the things that are not ephemeral, that are real, right? There's a quote by Baltasar Gracián, that he's a Jesuit priest, and he writes like the very famous book, the Hero, or I think it's called El Critión. But he has a quote, and he says, "The point of philosophy is to reflect upon death daily, so that you can do it well once." And I think there's much wisdom in what he says, is because the only thing, and again, unrelated to that, he goes on to say, look, all the things that you collect, Mick, they're all the things that I collect, IJ, all the prizes, all the status games, all the glories that you collect, you can be as glorious of a man, as honorable and as noble as a man, having lavish kingdoms and houses and material possessions. But on your deathbed, he's like, it's just you. You die naked. And on your deathbed, you cannot take any of the things that you've collected. The only thing you can take that you've collected are your virtues. And so you should spend the rest of your life collecting and cultivating your virtues. And Baltasar obviously very, if you haven't read his works, very, very funny guy, because he's a Jesuit priest, but he's actually hated by the Jesuit community because of his worldliness, quote unquote. But yeah, I think that version, of a full detachment of the materialistic world, I think is something that everybody must actively and intentionally make that decision to go on, so that at death, you take with you the only thing, whether you think there's something in the afterlife, right? The point is more so that the only thing you can take with you, if there is an afterlife, and on your deathbed, is your virtues.
Was there something you were hoping to share about your inner landscape that you didn't get to?
I would say that you ask very deep questions that I hadn't thought about before. Your ability to synthesize and ask a question, that's like definitely a superpower that I appreciate, because it's made me think more.
When you reflect on your life until now, what patterns emerge for you?
I think one of the patterns is the closeness to death that I, not in a sadistic manner, but in the way that in which Baltasar mentioned, and in the way in which obviously famously the Stoics mentioned. I think that's something that I realize I just cannot not think about. That's very much tied to my experience, and so that's something that I keep coming back to, especially when I'm thinking about things that I desire that aren't helpful in any way for me. But then when you put it in perspective of death, and of your mortality and your finiteness, and how there is much more to be learned, right? The things fade away. There's a very famous quote by Jesus, I think in the book of Matthew. He says, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul?" And I think it sort of ties to this idea of all the things that you collect. They could look great from an external perspective, but in the end, if those things that you've collected have driven you away from the path from Tao, then what's the point of it all, right? If they've actually made you more egotistical, more prideful, then for the Sufis, and you've totally misunderstood what the point of life is. Right? The point of life is to shed this ego, to destroy this ego. So I think that's sort of like a repeating theme in these books. When I'm reading, I'm like, man, I cannot believe this person's saying the same thing that this other person said. But it's not like I'm actively choosing this. Sometimes I haven't read these books, and so when I read them, I was like, oh wow, this is incredible that they have this sort of like, again, this perennialist wisdom that you can find.
One of the goals of crafting these conversational portraits is to cover how you're becoming fully yourself, and becoming because it's still the active process. In reflecting on this conversation, how do you feel about the person you're becoming?
If I died today, I'll answer it this way. If I died today, I would die knowing that I was on the path, and I would die a happy man. And that's the way I think that is the way one should live their life, in that in any moment, if you were to die, are the things that you're doing the things that are drawing you away or drawing you towards this path of drawing towards Tao or drawing you away from it?
We started off with learning about where you found your silence. And so now I'd like to give you the silence to have and or to fill. So the space is now yours.
I would ask you, is there something that you wanted to share that I interrupted, or that you didn't have the opportunity to share?
Only more questions. I want to explore how who you are is imbued in what you do. And I think it's not that you interrupted me. I realized I got greedy. I thought I could fit in more and more and more into a single episode, and that's not possible. I just need to create more portraits. That's the only answer.
Right. Right.
Monet didn't paint the lilies only once.
The water, and he paid them multiple, and he even created his own little pond just to draw it, right? Or I should say to paint it.
So I'm learning a bit more about it's okay to not get every question that I want to ask right away.
Yeah, that would I wouldn't have anything else to add. I think that would be I wouldn't have anything else to add.
Thank you for joining for your conversational portrait. The first
Thank you.
of your conversational portraits.
Thank you, Mick, for your brilliant questions. Probably some of the most thoughtful questions that I've heard, not towards me, but in general. Yeah.
Thank you for such kind words. I appreciate your generosity with your time and your receptivity, and most importantly, how imperative you find it to pursue these questions for yourself and to explore on the path that you're committed to.
I appreciate that, Mick. Thank you.